Chapter 1. The road to war. Life had been the same for hundreds of years. Then the war came, and nothing was ever the same again. The Book of Bryn Suri. The mystic talked to trees, danced to the sound of wind chimes, hated bathing, howled at the moon, and had recently leveled a mountain, wiping out centuries of dwarven culture in an instant. She had done so mostly out of grief, but partly out of anger. A dwarf had been insensitive. After the death of Suri's best friend, he should have been more sympathetic, but during the days since it happened, Suri had come to realize she could have shown more restraint. Perhaps merely setting Gronbach on fire or having the earth swallow the vile wretch would have been a better choice. Neither option had occurred to her at the time, and an entire civilization had suffered. It had been a bad day for everyone. Nearly a week later, Suri woke in a field amidst salafin ragwort and meadow thistle, the sun peeking over distant hills. Golden shafts made diamonds of dewdrops and revealed the labor of 1,000 spiders who had cast nets between blades of grass. Having spent the night outside, Suri too was soaked and a bit chilled, but the sun's kiss promised to make everything better. She sat in the dew, the sun on her face, and stared at the fields surrounding the seaside doll, listening to the faint hum of bumblebees as they began their morning's work. Then a butterfly flew across her side and ruined everything. Suri began to cry. She didn't bow her head, keeping her face to the sunlight. She let the tears roll down her cheeks, spilling onto the grass, adding to the dew. Her little body hitched and shuddered. Suri cried until she was out of tears, but the pain still tore at her heart. Eventually she merely sat in the field, shoulders stooped, arms limp, fingers reaching out for the warm fur that wasn't there since returning from across the sea. Most days started this way. Mornings offered a tiny respite from the pain, but before long she remembered and reality crashed in. Then the sky became less blue, the sun not nearly as bright, and not even the flowers could make her smile. And there was one more loss left to face. Orion was dying. Sorry. She was slow to react, slow to realize it was her name being called. Somewhere behind her the grass rustled and feet thumped. The rapid tempo of those footfalls indicated it could only be one person, and that meant just one thing. Sorry. Bryn called again. The mystic didn't bother to turn. Didn't want to see, didn't want to face. She's awake, Bryn shouted this time. Sari spun. Her eyes are open. Bryn was running, plunging through the tall grass, soaking her skirt. Every muscle in Suri's body came alive. She sprang up like a startled deer and sprinted past Bryn, racing toward the road. In no time she reached the tent Rain had built specifically for the Merleaf. When Suri burst in, Orion was still on the pallet, but her eyelids fluttered. Padera was helping her sit up to drink tiny sips. The old woman barked, I know you want to guzzle like a drunk, but trust me, it'll come right back up on you and me, even if you don't care. I do. Suri stood under the flap, staring. Part of her refused to believe what she was seeing. She was afraid it was merely a dream, and worried that the moment she embraced the sight, the illusion would dissolve and the pain would rush back with twice the force. She didn't know how many more blows she could survive. Come in, go out, pick one. Padera snapped. The old woman, her lips sunken over toothless gums, squinted with her one good eye against the blinding sunlight. Suri took a step forward and let the flap fall. The lamp was out, but sunlight burned brightly through the cloth walls. Orion was resting against Padera's shoulder. The old woman helped the Frey hold a ceramic cup to her lips. Over its top, the Frey peered back with weary eyes. The old woman tipped the vessel, and the Freys slurped loudly. Okay, that's enough for now, Padera said. We'll let that settle a minute. If it stays down, if you don't erupt like a geyser, I'll give you more. The cup came away and Sori waited. Arian's voice. Sori needed to hear it to be sure to make it real. The Freyed tried to say something but couldn't. She pointed apologetically at her throat. Sori panicked. What's wrong with her? Nothing, Padera grumbled. Well, nothing beyond sleeping for almost a week without food or water, which made her dry as the dust. She nearly became. Padera looked at the Frey with a small shake of her head and a confounded expression. With as little water as she's had, she ought to be dead. Any man, woman, child, rabbit, or sheep would have passed 3 days ago. Of course she's none of those. Is she? Once more sunlight pierced the room, blinding everyone. Bryn stood in the entryway holding the flap. She didn't say anything, just watch from the gap. Come and go out, pick one. Suri and Padera barked in unison. Sorry. Bryn stepped in, letting the flap fall. All of them watched. Orion the friar lifted her head slowly, focused on Suri, and smiled. Orion reached out a shaky hand. that was enough. Suri fell to her knees and discovered she still had tears left. She buried her face in the side of Arian's neck. I tried. Surya managed in between sobs. I didn't know what I was doing. I opened a door and found a dark river. I followed it toward a light, a wonderful and yet terrible light. I tried to pull you back to fix you, but she felt Arian's hand patting her head. Suri looked up. Not try it. Orion managed to croak with a voice as coarse as gravel. She then mouthed the word succeeded. Suri wiped her eyes and squinted. What with more effort the phrase said, you saved me. Suri continued to stare. You sure? Orion smiled. Pretty sure. Braith refused to sit. Something about being seated in the face of such lunacy felt too much like acceptance. The rest of the clan chieftains, who referred to themselves collectively as the Koenig's Council, sat in the familiar circle inside Dolter's courtyard. For chairs had been added, 3 to accommodate the chieftains of the Gullah clans, and an elaborate seat with carved arms for Persephone. Gavin Killian, the prolific father of numerous sons, and the new chieftain of Clan Ren, sat in Persephone's old chair. Nephron wasn't seated either. He was up and speaking. Persephone nodded when the Galantian paused. She's not actually considering this, is she? Besides the 10 chieftains, most of the other usuals were there except for Bryn, the king's personal keeper of ways. Wraith had last seen her heading toward Padera's tent, the one they had Orion in the death house, some called it, since the Merliath hadn't shown any sign of life in nearly a week. The other non-chieftains and attendants included Moya, Persephone's ever-present shield with her famous bow, the dwarf named Frost who always stood in for Ronan and reported on weaponry progress, Malcolm, who simply had a habit of showing up, and Nephron, who represented the fray. That's how Wraith saw Nephron's role, as the voice of a small band of warriors. Given that Wraith represented only himself and Teshi couldn't begrudge the Galantian leader a place at the council, at least I shouldn't. But I'm not making insane recommendations. That will get everyone killed. We must take Alan Reist, and we must do it immediately. Nephron repeated. He wasn't asking or suggesting. This wasn't a bit of advice or an option being presented. The fray leader was demanding agreement. Wraith usually refrained from talking in the meetings, and he felt Nephron should keep quiet too, for the very same reason. They represented virtually no one. But Wraith didn't like the look on Persephone's face. Her expression indicated she was weighing Nephron's words carefully. None of the other chieftains possessed the courage to challenge the fray leader, so Wraith had to say something. Lack of proper weapons had been the reason he'd refused to be the king in the first place, and Nephron wanted to take the risk before they had time to prepare. Persephone had returned from Belgric with the secret of iron, but forging enough weapons for an army would take time. Your recklessness demonstrates why Persephone is the king and you are not. Wraith said loudly to Nephron, drawing attention. You're free. You don't care about the lives of us rooms. The only thing you care about is winning. The amount of blood spilled while reaching your goal is inconsequential, because it won't be yours. Attacking Alan Reist before we're properly trained and have adequate weapons will be suicide. Hundreds, maybe thousands could die in those wars, and then no one is going to die. Nephron replied in a superior tone that suggested he was speaking to an imbecile. Wraith took a step toward him. If we attack one of the most fortified strongholds in the world, with farmers armed merely with mattocks, men will die. Many men. Wraith turned to the other chieftains. You've been to Alan Reist, right? He pointed at Nephron. Isn't it filled with an army of fray warriors? Like him, charging those walls will be like slapping a beehive with a stick, except these bees don't just sting, they cut off your head with very sharp bronze swords. While hiding behind massive shields, Persephone was paying attention to him, listening. That's something. At least I'm not asking for anyone from here to fight. Nephron spoke to Persephone rather than to Wraith. Your people won't even have to get near the wrist. They will merely be decorative, a garnish, if you will. Nephron began to pace back and forth. That fortress is my home. I own it. My father was the head of the Ansteria tribe, the people who have lived in that fortress for centuries. He was the supreme commander of all the western outposts. That position typically falls to the son upon the father's death, which makes me lord of the wrist. But the Thane, the leader of your people, put someone else in charge after your father challenged him. Correct? Tegan of Clan Warwick asked. Thank you, Tegan. At least one person is paying attention. True, Nephron replied. But that fray isn't well liked by my tribe, and the Astari have been ill-treated for centuries, alienated and exiled through no fault of their own. They need a leader who understands their plight and can right their wrongs. Nephren sighed. Do you think this is some impetuous idea that popped into my head this morning? I've worked on this plan for quite some time. I know how to take Alan Rist, and I can do so without the loss of a single life. That's not possible, Wraith said. We need to. Nephren rolled his eyes. Allow me to explain why we must act immediately. I'll do so in short sentences, with small words. Right now the Thane is preparing his own forces. He'll need to marshal his troops on the frontier to attack us. The best soldiers are the Insteria tribe, my brethren, and they are headquartered at Alan Rist. The Insteria are the greatest warriors in the world. Without them, the Thane has no troops. I intend to steal his strength, but we have to move quickly. We can't allow Lothian to reach Alan Rist first. Nephren moved closer to Persephone. I can nullify the whole Instarsha tribe from Irvunan to marriage. Doing so will cut off the Thane's arms. He'll have no army to fight for him. Will they fight for us? Siegel asked. Nephren looked at the Gularan chieftain as if he were a child. Of course not. Frey don't kill Frey. But if you do as I say, I can ensure that they won't kill Runes either. And without his warrior tribe, the Thane will need to train others. That he pointed at Wraith still without looking at him. Will give us time to forge weapons, something we can do more effectively. Behind the Rist's walls, Nephren began counting off with his fingers. Alan Rist has tools, facilities, shelter, and food, everything required to build the sort of fighting force needed to face the Thane's inevitable assault. But how do we take it? Tegan asked. Just leave that to me. See, that's where I have a problem, Wraith said. You expect us to trust you? Nephren dragged a hand over his face in frustration. It doesn't matter if you have doubts. The rooms will be perfectly safe. I don't want any of them within a quarter mile of the Rist. I and my Galantians will secure the fort. I only want you to be there. You're certain the rooms won't have to fight? Persephone asked. That's correct. I want you and your people to stand across the Burn River Gorge in the high plains of Doria. Is that too much to ask? Persephone looked at Wraith. You can't listen to him, Wraith said. This is foolishness. He can't take an entire fortress with a party of 7. Either he is delusional or this is some kind of trap. At least wait until we have 1,000 swords and shields. He turned to Frost. How long will that take? The dwarf puffed air through his beard and mustache, clearing the hair out of the way in order to speak. We've selected a dozen good men who are eager and capable of learning, but we're still struggling with the method and system. Although Roan carefully watched the swordsmiths produce an iron blade, she apparently missed a number of details. We are still working out the process, but we're getting there. Once we have the steps down, those 12 will take what they've learned and train a smith in every village in Roland, and those smiths will take on apprentices, expanding our numbers. When the system is perfected and people are trained, the work won't take long, but getting all that going is the problem. He rubbed his chin. I estimate we could outfit a small army in a year there, Braith said, and in that time, we can train the men to it. Will be too late by then, Nephren said. The Thane will consolidate his hold on the frontier before winter. This is a race, and we've already delayed too long. Besides, there is a fine smithy inside the fortress, and a few residents in the city have excellent forges and tools. Also, the Frey looked at Persephone. Where will the people of Ren winter here? Will you shelter from the icy blasts against that wall? He looked to Lippard. Do you have room for them inside the city's walls? Persephone's eyes darkened. Wraith was losing her to him, which made it worse. My way will ensure we can defend ourselves if things go wrong, Wraith declared. If he fails to deliver on his outlandish promises. Nephren smiled as he cut Wraith off. And my way will win this war. Wraith glared at Nephron, but the Freys steadfastly refused to even glance his way. Nephron continued to study Persephone. How soon would you want to move on Erlenrus? She asked. Immediately, Nephron said. We have already wasted too much time. He gestured at the dull around him. While we sit and talk, who knows what the Thane is doing? I'd feel better if we had some artistic support. Persephone looked Wraith's way in case anything goes wrong. But Orion can't be moved and Suri won't leave her side. We don't need a Merlife to take Alan Rist, and we can't afford to wait. Nephren said. Orion is more likely to die than recover, and that mystic child is no artist. Waiting for Arian's death won't change a thing. Bryn raced into the courtyard, and all heads turned. She was moving so fast she had to skid to a stop. A huge smile stretched her cheeks. Aryans awake, they weren't an army, far from it. The course of humanity had shifted in a very real sense. Suri was certain she'd seen rainstorms with fewer drops than the number of people walking north, and while Suri wasn't an expert on such matters, she imagined that even the worst army carried weapons. Unlike the crowd around her, they were shepherds, farmers, leather workers, hunters, woodcutters, fishermen, brewers, and traders. Most didn't own weapons. They carried bags and baskets. The rumpled host of that would-be army struggled to walk in line. They also complained about the pace, the road, and the sun or its absence. When the rain came, most of the women had been left at home, except for those of Dalren, who didn't have a place to stay. Those without small children walked alongside their men, carrying bundles of food and clothes. The majority of the host was ahead of the wagon, where Suri and Orion sat, all marching along the road that went by Dolren, the same path they'd traveled down seemingly a lifetime ago. Orion and Suri were tucked alongside barrels, sacks, pots, and were rocking and bouncing with the ruts and dips. The Frey had declared herself fit to travel, but she wasn't up for the long walk. Padera and Gifford, who served as cooks to that migratory march and also looked after Orion, rode with them. The 2-1 seats on the wagon by virtue of Nephrin's desire to travel quickly. Suri didn't make a habit of riding in the wagon, but she checked on Orion frequently and sometimes napped among the sacks in the afternoon. No one questioned her right to do so. No one spoke to her much at all. Rumors had circulated about her incident in the land of the dwarfs, while Suri had always received stares as an outsider and a mystic. Now the expressions of curiosity and disapproval were replaced by looks of fear. Folks sped up, slowed down, or even changed directions to keep their distance, with Persephone, Moira, Braun, and the dwarfs all so busy. The only ones who spoke with Suri were Padera, Gifford, and Bryn. Everyone else acted as if she were poisonous. I've always liked being alone, she reminded herself. I prefer it. Too many people in one place isn't natural. This is better. But she wasn't alone. Suri was surrounded by people, yet not a part of them. She was the daisy among the daffodils, the fly in the goat's milk, the butterfly in the army. Suri turned and saw the trees off to their left, a slope running upward, leafy boughs nudging into darker piney ridges. She knew that line, that rise of trees, that curve just beyond was a river, and over the next hill they would see the full face of the wood, the crescent forest. We're almost back, Suri said. She checked the sun. By midday we'll be there. How do you feel? She asked Orion. We'll walk slowly, no need to rush. Orion, who was sitting up and wrapped in a light shawl, appeared puzzled. Are we going somewhere different than everyone else? Yes, to the Hawthorne Glen home. But Persephone, I thought we were headed to Allen Rest. Orion looked perplexed. That's where she's going. We're going home, Suri said. You'll love it, Orion. The garden will be a disaster, but I'll take care of that. You won't have to do a thing except rest and get stronger. We'll go swimming. Sorry, there's war starting, Orion said. Sorry, believed the Frey's voice reflected her health, and Arian's speech was still far too windy and hollow. Yes, she glanced at the men with hoes and mattocks on their shoulders, and in the glen we won't even know it. We'll be safe and happy. In a way it'll be like old times, the way it was with Tora. Persephone had wanted Suri and Orion to go to the Frey fortress, but Suri didn't think war sounded very pleasant. Instead, she had come up with a better plan. The two of them would ride on the wagon back to the Crescent Forest, then hop off and walk to the Hawthorne Glen. Orion was still weak, so they would go slow and stop often. Might take all day, but once there, Suri would show Orion the most beautiful place in the world, the little vale where the sunlight was more golden, the water sweeter, and where birds of different species sang in harmony. Suri knew Orion would love it, and in that wondrous place the Frey would grow strong again. And then Suri, Orion stared at her. Are you ready to talk? Suri looked away, focusing on the forest as home came into view over the rise. Are you going to tell me what happened? Arian asked. What do you mean? Last thing I remember, we were trapped under a mountain. We had a deal, you and I. Since I'm here, I have to assume you didn't keep your end of the bargain. Don't you think it's time we talked about what happened? Padera shifted uneasily. You should rest, the old woman said. Orion ignored her and continued to focus on Suri. The Crescent Forest revealed itself in its formal gown of deep summer green. By contrast, the fields that skirted it were bright gold, with speckles of orange, yellow, and purple. Birds were swooping low, bees darting, and above it all bright white puffy clouds drifted without a care. Aren't you going to tell me what happened to Mina? At the sound of the name, Suri tore her sight from the beautiful vision. but didn't look at the Frey or say a word. "Sorry, I'm not an idiot. I didn't say you were. Why sorry? Why did you do it?" Sorry lowered her head, her lips bunching up in protest. She didn't want to have this conversation. Not now, not with Orion, not with anyone, not ever. You loved her, Orion said. Still do the words escaped. A feeble quivering hand touched Suri's wrist, long delicate frayed fingers gently rubbing. "I wanted you to kill me, not her. I know. Sorry, I can't go home with you." Suri pulled away, folded her hands in front of her, and looked back out at the forest. The vast expanse of green filled the view to the west. As Suri watched it roll past, she thought it looked so strangely small. "Has it always been that way? You can't go either," Orion said. "You know that, right? You're a butterfly now in more ways than I would have ever expected. Days of eating leaves are over. The flowers need you. Your home isn't in the hawthorn glen. Sorry, it's in the sky. You can't hide. You need to fly. You need to show everyone the beauty of those wings." Sari frowned and climbed off the slow-moving wagon. "Right now, I think I'd rather walk." She let the wagon roll ahead. This left her at the rear of the long column, quiet there, less hectic, and she enjoyed the feel of her feet on familiar, albeit sadly trampled grass. Despite bringing up the tail end of the migration, Siri discovered she wasn't alone. Wraith trudged along in the soft ruts left by the wagon wheels. He had his lemur folded and tied shorter and looser in the way most men did. That time of year, it exposed more of his hairy legs and arms. Furry was the thought that came to mind. He glanced her way, but didn't speak, and the two fell into a silent tandem march. They walked side by side in silence until they came to the intersection of the trail that led to Dulrun. Suri didn't think she had come at it from this direction. Since the morning after Grin the Brown was killed, both she and Wraith slowed. Both looked at the nondescript trail, just a narrow path that wound through tall brown grass. Up that way stood the shattered remains of a wall, a lodge, and a well. The past that marked a turning point. Strange how deciding to walk one way rather than another can change your whole life. Wraith managed to put her own thoughts into words. "I probably shouldn't have gone down that road." Part of Suri wholeheartedly agreed. If she had refrained from going to Darren that spring, Mina would still be alive, and the two of them would be enjoying another summer together. Of course, if she hadn't gone, everyone else would likely be dead. "Do bad things happen if I don't know about them?" Suri sighed and wondered if Wraith had been speaking to her by just talking to himself. She also wasn't entirely sure who she spoke to when she said, "The worst part is that I still can't tell if it was worth it." They looked at each other knowingly, then resumed following the wagons at a greater distance, lagging back, letting the world drift away. "I wish I were going home." Suri kicked a loose stone into the tall grass. "I wish I weren't," Wraith said. He glanced over. "I'm sure yours is much nicer." He pointed at the wagon ahead of them. "How's Orion?" Annoying. Suri expected him to show surprise and ask why. Instead, Wraith simply nodded as if he understood everything. "I wanted her to come home with me to the forest, to the glen where I used to live. I figured we could be happy there. But she insists we have to be part of this war." Sounds remarkably like perfidy. "Really?" Wraith nodded. "Won't listen to me. Listens to Nephren though. She hears him just fine. We're going to war against the Frey. And whose counsel does she take? So you don't want to go to this wrist place either?" "I'd rather we were all in your glen." He wiped sweat from his eyes and peered up at the blazing sun as if he and it were having a disagreement. "Can you swim there?" Suri smiled. "In a clear lake with swans. Got food more than enough." "Sounds perfect." "It is," she said, and meant it. "Over there, right?" He pointed at the cleft in the forest. "Yep," she replied. "Up that slope around to the left, and then over into the valley. We could arrive before nightfall. Easy. No one would even know we left." The two looked at the wagons and the long column of men snaking to the north, which kicked up a cloud of dust. No one was looking back, but if they did, Sarier and Wraith would be hidden by the cloud. They could slip away unseen and vanish into obscurity forever. The war would go on, but without them. "Do bad things happen if I don't know about them?" They both stopped, standing still in the middle of the road, listening to the sounds of the wagons fade. "What do you think?" Suri asked. Wraith sighed, then shook his head. "We can't leave them, and it seems stupid to start being smart now." Suri nodded. "Yes, you're absolutely right. You must be the world's wisest." She caught herself mortified. Everything felt so familiar that the words just came out as they always used to, just as if she were walking with Sari. Began to cry. She felt guilty and hated herself for betraying Mina's memory so easily. He stood quietly waiting beside her. Without judgment, Suri embraced him, then there was no thought in it she needed to hug something, and he was there. Suri thought he might pull away, but he didn't. Instead, she felt his arms wrap around her, settling gently, holding her. Wraith never said a word, and she knew that was exactly how it should be between friends. Chapter 2. Before the Bronze Gates, Alan Rist was just one of 7 Frey fortresses that dominated our borders. But it was more than the seat of the Astaria tribe, and the tomb of a long-dead Fane. Alan Rist was the personification of Frey power, and the absurdity of challenging it. Wraith pulled Persephone up the last ledge. She could have climbed it on her own, and none of the chieftains had needed or been offered a hand, but she took as Persephone felt it best to be agreeable when she had the luxury, knowing she couldn't always be so generous. That's what she told herself, but she knew that if anyone else had made the gesture, she'd have waved them off. Wraith was brave, capable, and handsome, wearing his lemur with a casual indifference. The young Duran was a popular topic among the women, but he took no notice of their flirtations. What he wanted she couldn't give. Persephone was still married to her dead husband in ways she couldn't put into words, or even thoughts. Emotions had a language of their own that didn't always translate. Wraith and her husband were nothing alike. Regland, nearly 30 years her senior, had been more like a father, a teacher, a guide. With Wraith, she was the wise one, the steady hand that kept the rows straight, and yet Wraith's hand felt good, safe, warm, strong. She was the Kinnig chieftain of the 10 clans, supreme ruler of millions. But she still needed more power. Couldn't replace respect, devotion couldn't replace friendship, and nothing could replace the enveloping warmth of love. He did love her, wanted her, and while she couldn't grant his wish, at least not yet, she cherished the idea. The gift of his desire was another of those impossible to translate, difficult to corral feelings. Passion was a wild, selfish thing that didn't respect boundaries or common sense, but without it, life felt pointless. What did you call this? She looked around, getting a feel for the natural pillar of rock rising 60 feet above the plain. Misery Rock, Wraith replied. The sheer drop on all sides of that far too small for comfort pillar produced a flutter in her stomach. She nodded. I can see that. Sure. Persephone walked in a tight circle, shuffling her feet, too scared to lift them. Falling was an irrational fear as long as she didn't do anything crazy. The rock was as flat as a table, but she didn't trust herself. Stumbling is not an option unless flying is. To Persephone had never been one for heights. As a child, she stopped climbing trees at a young age and escaped roof thatching duties by claiming illnesses that were greatly exaggerated. Standing on Misery Rock, looking down and seeing the tops of all those walnut-sized heads that made up the ruling clans, she felt dizzy. How did I ever find the courage to jump off that waterfall in the Crescent Forest? That incident seemed decades ago, rather than just a few short months. Wolves, she recalled. Yes, a pack of wolves in pursuit provided the necessary incentive. Persephone watched in awe as Suri scampered up, as if the summit were a foot off the ground. The young woman was beyond fearless. She appeared thoroughly bored from where they stood. Persephone could see for miles. Did you live around here? Persephone asked Wraith. He pointed toward the northeast. Most of Doria was a dusty plateau, one great rock interrupted by jagged stone formations, like the one they stood on. Looking in the direction he indicated, she spotted a black mark on the consistently blonde plain. That was my village, Clempton. Wraith said. 37 buildings, 40 families, and almost 200 people. He continued to stare without blinking, a hard, brutal look. She wondered what he was thinking, then imagined herself gazing on the ruins of Dauren. Persephone put a hand on his arm. Her touch broke his stare, and he offered her a forced smile. All the rule and chieftains were with her on the summit, while the Gullah leaders were with their men strategically stationed among the dips and clefts of the Dorian plain. Nephron had positioned them the night before, saying he knew the places where Alan Rist's watchtower was. Blind Persephone had been forced to repeat his instructions. The Gullah refused to take orders from the Freya, wild and vicious people. The Gulurans were little more than a pack of rabid animals. Great when you needed that sort of thing, maddening when you didn't. Persephone forced herself to inch closer to the edge to get a better look at the world below. The northern boundary of the Yellow Plateau was a steep, jagged gorge that, from their vantage point, formed a curve resembling a frown. At the bottom of that canyon, the Burn River flowed, which historically marked the end of Rulian and the start of the Freylands. Somewhere beneath Misery Rock, a worn path appearing little more than a chalk Mark on that open plain ran north from Drya to the gorge. The vague line ended at a set of white stone stairs that climbed to a bridge for miles. The only place to safely ford the river was that span that linked the Frey and human sides of the canyon. Like a single stitch in the gaping wound that was Granford on the other side was the city and fortress of Alan Rist, with its great dome and soaring watchtower, the whole of it protected by massive stone walls and a pair of impenetrable bronze gates. Persephone had crossed that bridge of sculptured stone every year while married to Reglan. Each time had terrified her. We had been invited, but I was still scared there. Up the stairs, Tegan announced. The chieftain of Clan Warwick looked like an overgrown dwarf with neat dark hair and a brushed beard, possessed of a sarcastic wit. He had a sharp mind and had become one of Persephone's closest advisors. Tegan pointed, and everyone on Misery Rock looked toward the Granford Bridge. "I can't believe you agreed to this." Wraith was shaking his head while looking at the sky. "Nephren knows what he's doing," Persephone said, trying to sound more confident. Then she felt her hands were clenched tight. She forced them open and made a deliberate effort to relax her shoulders. "What if he's wrong? What if they kill him?" Wraith asked. "My people aren't prepared for this." Harkins said, "Most of Clan Melon are carrying farm tools. We can't fight. If that happens, we fall back. We already have a sizable lead." Ephraim told them, and Nephron. Harkin asked, "If things don't go well, will he retreat?" "I don't think Nephronori's Galacticians understand that concept." Tegan said, "They always assume they'll win. Let's hope there's a good reason for that." Persephone straightened up. She kept reminding herself to stand tall. Her mother had always complained about her bad posture. No one will respect the wife of a chieftain who ounces over like a troll. A mother could never have imagined that Persephone would be a chieftain, much less the queen. But Persephone guessed the advice was still valid. "There's a first time for everything," Krugen said. "Then pray this is not that time." True to his word, Nephron hadn't asked a single human to cross the bridge with him. Persephone's army was barely in sight of the Frey forming on the far side of the burn. The Gullo were even farther away, more than a mile, having formed on the crest of the high plain. That was the way Nephron wanted it. Persephone hoped that his plan was designed to give them ample time to scatter if something went wrong. But Tegan was correct. Galantians didn't understand defeat. She agreed that the odds of Nephron anticipating failure were equal to his expecting a day without a sunrise. From the vantage point of Mishra, Persephone could see the Galantians approach. Alan rised. The little troop of Frey appeared like a line of 7 ants. They reached the bridge and without hesitation began to cross, trying to see better. Persephone took a step forward, forgetting, if only for that instant, that she was standing near a deadly precipice. Wraith caught her by the arm, silently reminding her of the danger and his concern for her. She glanced at him, and Wraith let go. Looking embarrassed, Harkin, the chief of Clan Melon, shook his head in awe. "Fearless, crazy," muttered Krugen, whose only interest beyond fine clothing was sleep. Something the man did a great deal of snoring, far too loudly to hide the fact. "Why isn't anyone stopping them?" Lippert asked. "Same reason you wait when catching rabbits," Wraith replied. "Better to be sure you have them fully in the snare before pulling it closed." The Soprano's hands resumed their fists, and much to the dismay of her dead mother, she was imitating a troll again. "What's that?" Krugen pointed. "Do you see it?" Hakan asked. "On the plain on our side, more Frey." Wraith said. Persephone saw them as well. 2 bronze-armored warriors had appeared out of nowhere, cutting off Nephron's retreat. "Where they come from?" Tegan asked. "Cracks," Wraith explained. "The rocks out there are split with fissures and fractures. You can get into them. Cover yourself in a dirt-colored blanket and an enemy will walk right by. We did it all the time." "Shouldn't Nephron know about that?" Roygan asked. "And there you have it, not as smart as he thinks," Wraith concluded with a marbled, self-righteous tone. Persephone knew he was directing his frustration at Nephron, but she felt it spilling on her. After all, she had been the one who had sanctioned this action. The callousness of his cold judgment stung, because he'd been right, and she hadn't listened. "Do you think they planned for this?" A word of the NADAC pleaded, as if those gathered on that rock could grant wishes. "The Galantians," Tegan said with an incredulous expression. "They don't plan for anything. Forethought ruins the adventure." I'm told. Bolward frowned, his mouth still partially open, his shoulders slumping. Persephone took another step forward once more. Wraith grabbed her arm. The first time had been bad enough. Twice was uncalled for. Persephone was about to chide him, But then she looked down and saw she was less than a foot from the edge, sucking in a short breath she drew. "Back can't afford to lose both you and the Galentians in one afternoon," Rafe said. "Lose them." The idea, so impossible, coalesced for the first time. "What if they are killed or taken? What happens to them? What happens to us?" Phoebe looked down at the hundreds of her people nearby, and out beyond them at the thousands. She turned to reassure herself that Suri was still with them. The girl had leveled a mountain, so she ought to be able to protect them from a few hundred fray. That was why she was on the rock, why Persephone had insisted she come. But Persephone had no real clue how magic worked, what Suri was really able to do. And the mystic had embraced Arian's distaste for killing a good thing, Persephone often told herself. But just then she wasn't so certain. Persephone looked at the black patch on the plain, the village that had once housed 40 families, and wondered if she had made her first and last mistake, as the king of the 10 clans, clutching the rolled-up flag in his right hand, Nephron led his Galentians across the Granford Bridge toward the Bronze Gate 40 feet above the entrance. The crossed spears, symbol of one-time fame. Alan Rist frowned down. It would have been damn hard to erase, but the fact that Petragar hadn't tried illustrated the difference between the current ruler of the Rist and himself. One of the differences, only Firil knew how long that particular list might be. If anyone thought to sit and compare, Nephron imagined that he and Petragar didn't even chew food the same way. If the situation were reversed, Nephron's own symbol would have replaced the mark of Rist. Nephron didn't have a symbol yet, but he would soon. A dragon, or perhaps a lion, something fierce, something powerful, something worthy. All great leaders needed to leave their mark on the world, and he would have already chiseled his on that wall. "You shouldn't have come back," Sakara said, standing first and foremost among a brace of shields at the far end of the bridge. He wore full armor, as if he expected trouble. He also wore the red-plumed crest on his helm, an indication that the spear commander had risen in rank since the Galentians' banishment. "Couldn't stay away." Tek Chin threw out his arms and puckered kisses at Sakar. "We missed you too much." Sakar frowned and shook his head. The captain of the Rist wasn't in a joking mood. "You're an idiot." Tek Chin, his gaze moved to Grigor and paused briefly on the wooden box the giant carried. Then it shifted to the flag in Nephron's hand. "Surrender or truce flag." Ellison, an older Frey who had been a close friend and advisor to Nephron's father, stood on Sakara's right and answered first. "Truth. When have you known the Galentians to surrender?" Sika kept his eyes on Nephron. "You know it's customary to waive that before approaching. Not that it would do any good. The Fane has declared you exiles, no longer protected by Fair Isles law." There was a terrible gravity in his tone and enough remorse in his eyes for Nephron to make a mental note. Tekken chuckled as he folded his arms across his chest. Nephron had given orders that no one was to touch weapons, and Tekken was likely going through withdrawal, so this is your big chance to rid yourself of those gambling debts. "You owe me, isn't it?" "This isn't a joke," Sykar shouted. "They're going to." Overhead horns blared, and the gates opened. "Quiet," Tek Jun said. "Your boss is coming. Don't worry, I won't tell him anything." Sykar didn't look irritated. He looked sad. He slowly shook his head as he sighed. "Relax, Sykar," Ephron told him. "I'm back now. I'll make everything right again. They're going to execute you. You understand that, right?" Nephron only smiled. Out of the gate poured a cohort of Insteria warriors. Nephron didn't need to look behind him to know that more would be blocking their retreat. He guessed Petragar had turned out the entire first spear to welcome them. The show of force was more than a compliment, more even than evidence of Petragar's cowardice. It was exactly what Nephron needed. The warriors fanned out in precision to either side of the bridge, filling the landing before the gates and denying them entrance. Nephron didn't have any intention of taking another step. He had planned this meeting down to the block of stone he stood on, and more importantly, the landing where the Asteria had gathered after centuries. Nephron knew every blind spot and advantage point. Petragar was the last one out, a brave one. He is at his side, waddled a virtuous legate to the Fane, a portly Guidery. He'd somehow managed to rise in station or fall out of favor in order to earn his post in the wilderness of Evelyn. Virtue had accompanied Petragar when the latter arrived to replace Nephron's dead father. As Lord of the Rist, all Nephron knew about the man was his complicity in the plan to send Ratnagar and the other giants to destroy Dalrun and kill Nephron. Orion and Wraith, the boy and his weasel, make quite the pair. Nephron, son of Zephron, Firdamus began. You have been shut up, Nephron ordered. I didn't come all this way to speak to you. Petrarch's eyes widened. You have didn't come to talk to you, either, you son of the tutling witch. Petrarch looked confused by the runic insult, the tone of Nephron's voice, and everything that was just the sort of fray he was. While he looked to the others for understanding, Nephron took in the gathered faces of his family. He knew them all. Nephron's father was a tyrant when it came to his son Zephron, Lord of Alan Rist and Supreme Commander of all the Western outposts, granted Nephron no privileges or special treatment. His son was forced to sleep in the barracks with the other in Styria. Nephron was also made to take his meals in the communal dining hall. Zephron's son marched in the same mud and fought and bled alongside the lowest soldier. At the time, Nephron had protested, but now, while standing on the Granford Bridge, he mentally thanked his father. This was just the second time he'd done that. The first was when Zephron had gotten himself killed during the Yuli Verma. I've come home to speak to my brothers. The moment he said this, Grigor set the box down and Nephron stepped up. Astoria, he shouted from his elevated position, wielding the still-rolled flag as a baton, conducting a symphony of eyes. The Lord of Alan Rist has returned. I come as a liberator to free the Astoria from the tyranny of morons and cowards. How dare you, Petergan nearly screamed, his voice a perfectly discrediting screech. You are for too long we have suffered the indignities and humiliation of a Fane who does not respect us, who does not appreciate us, who does not love us. Nephron had no trouble drowning out Petrarch's squeals. The Galantian leader had a good voice for speaking loud, deep, confident. You are a traitor, Petrarch shouted. I'm the son of a traitor. Without looking at him, Nephron chose to respond to the accusation, mostly because it dovetailed neatly with his speech. He hadn't expected help, certainly not from Petragar, but Nephron wasn't above accepting it when offered. My father gave his life for his tribe in service to his people, to free them from exile, from the mud and the blood that only we are forced to suffer. We fight and die while the Mirilith, Umalain, Nilnet, Elwyn, and Gwydri all enjoy the benefits of our sacrifice. Even the Ascenda are allowed to return across the Nidwalden. Only the Astaria are banned from our ancestral home. Why is that? Because it is the Fane's decision, not yours. Petrarch shouted. His voice sounded thin and greedy. Indeed, Nephron was really starting to appreciate Petrarch's assistance. The weeping willow of Ephraim possessed the unexpected virtue of making him look good, a gift Nephron loved more than all others, because the Fane has decreed that we who shoulder the greatest burden should receive scorn and humiliation as our reward. Those of you who are in Estramaden, those who witnessed my father's challenge, can attest to this. Were those the acts of an honorable Fane who respects his people? Or did he act the tyrant, imposing his rule through terror? Sakar, Patriga yelled, arrest him, get him off that box. Sakar hesitated. They really hate him. This might be easier than I expected. Let me explain why I came. Nephron softened his tone and said, I am here to rescue you, all of you. Alan Rist is the only home I've ever known, the Astaria, my family. I've come to save you. You're the one who needs saving. Petragard growled, pushing forward through unresponsive ranks. For many years, I have warned that the runes are capable of combat equal to the skill of the Fray. Few believed. He focused on Sykar. I was proven correct. When Shigen was killed while on patrol at the Forks, Sigan was murdered while he lay unconscious. Sakai said, doesn't matter. I personally witnessed a rune warrior kill Grindel, slaughtered him with a perfect blow to the neck, severing his head from his shoulders. You remember Grindel, don't you? This drew a reaction from every face, including Sikar's. He turned and, like many others, looked at Petragar. Is that true? Skarar asked. I was told that something Aaron killed Grindel, and you didn't tell us, and Grindel wasn't unconscious at the time. Nephron said, if that's not enough, then know that I myself have fought the ruins, and in Ren I was nearly killed in a one-on-one battle. Only the timely intervention of Sabek saved me. He paused and looked at Sabek, who nodded. This brought even greater expressions of shock to those gathered. Then you have lost your skill, Petragar said as he shoved past the remaining shields to join Sakar. The Lord of the Wrist shouted in frustration, draw your weapon and take them into the dungeon, or kill them where they stand. But do it now, or you'll be accused of defying the Fane, and will be prosecuted as one of them. Sakar recoiled from Petragar's rant. He made a miserable face, then sighed and reached for his weapon. You don't want to do that, Tekken said. Shut up. Sakar pulled his sword as if it weighed more than Grigor. For once, can't you just shut up? I know it's hard to believe, Nephron told Sakar, But this time Tekken's right, put the sword away, I can't. Skara shook his head. You shouldn't have come back. Skara was a good soldier, which meant he was no free thinker. He was a strong pair of arms for whoever pulled the strings. And at that moment the puppet master was Petragar. Time to snip those cords before you order my friends to kill us. He spoke slowly, clearly, and loudly as he unrolled the ruddy red face of the flag. Let me show you one more thing that you might not have noticed. There's no need for your theatrics. We've already seen the ragged band of ruins you traveled with. Scar said you saw only the ones I wanted you to know about. Nephrons spoke to Sakaar. Let me introduce the ones I didn't. Nephron waved the flag over his head in the distance. Horns replied. Nephron didn't turn, didn't need to. Everything that happened behind him was reflected in the wide-eyed faces of those before him. Even Sykar's mouth opened. Petrarch appeared as if he might faint. Seal the gate, seal the gate. Petrarch cried. Wouldn't do that either. Tixon grinned once more. Tech-Chim defies the odds by being correct. Nephron stopped waving and lowered the flag. What you are looking at are 5,000 battle-hardened Durg-armed Guluran warriors. And before you start thinking the walls of Alan Rist will save you, consider this. We also have a Merilith. Merilith, Sakar and Petragar said together, and like an echo in a cavern the word was repeated throughout the crowd. You know her as Orion, the tutor of the prince. She was sent to arrest you. Petrarch said. Changed her mind even. She recognizes that the Fane has gone mad, and the Fane sends giants to punish her for that error in judgment. A giant mistake. Tekken chuckled. Nephron smiled and shook his head. Yeah, that didn't work out so well for the giants. They're dead now, and she's working with us, so closing those gates won't help. She blow them open or simply tear down your walls. You're lying. Petragar said. Defrin turned to the Galentians. On your honor, speak the truth before your brethren. And our Lord Firo is the Merilith Arian, former tutor of the prince, in our company by her choice and assisting us in our endeavors together. In one voice the Galentians replied. Yes, by our honor. You're lying. Petragar howled. They're all lying. Irritated beyond the ability to keep quiet, Allison turned and faced him. These are Galentians, and they're liars. His voice was a shrill rattle. Don't say that again, Sykar said, setting his jaw so that his words were forced through his teeth. Don't you tell Lord Petrarch what to do. Vertumus spoke up. Petrarch is in command here. That's right, Petrarch said. I am in charge. These Galentians are wanted heretics and traitors and are to be returned to Estrada, or if they resist they will be executed. This is the will of the Fane. He faced Sykar. Do your duty. The war is going to begin here. Nephron told Sykar, I can't allow this fortress to stand. If it stands against me, you can't ask us to kill our own. Even if the Fane is a poor choice to rule, Feral's law still stands. I'm not asking you to do anything. Nephron began rolling the flag up again. In fact, I want you to do absolutely nothing. This was the key to the lock that Nephron inserted and prepared to turn. He could see the surprise and more importantly, the eager interest in Sakar's eyes. The soldier was trapped between duty and honor, desperate for a way out. Nothing I don't under. I said arrest or kill him, Petrarch barked, causing Ellison to roll his eyes. I'm the leader of the Astaria. Nephron responded to Sakar, ignoring Petragar. I don't ask my people to do anything I am not willing to do myself, and I'm not willing to break Feral's law. If I were, do you honestly think he'd still be alive? Nephron used a rolled flag to point at Petrarch. All I am asking is that you don't get in the way. Just stay out of it. If you need to, simply report to the Fane that you were overwhelmed, that you had no choice but to surrender to a vastly superior force certain to slaughter every last Frey and Alan Rist, which I'm afraid is the truth of the matter. That's why I brought them, why they're here. The runes are here to absolve you, to expunge any concerns about tarnishing your honor. Sakar narrowed his eyes. What is your plan? Stop listening to him. Petrarch gave Sakar a shove from behind, which anyone who knew Sakar even a little would recognize as a mistake. The captain of the guard brought his elbow around and slammed it into Petrarch's jaw. The phrase screamed, staggered, and fell without looking back. Sakar addressed Nephron again. How do you see this working? The rooms are in total revolt. The Gullah and the Rulin, they've united and appointed a king. Yes, we know, Ellison said, looking past the Galentians toward the hills. The runes will be the arms we shall use to make the Fane understand reason, Nephron explained, or the swords by which we will replace him. But this is— Sakar looked pained. I hate to say it, but Petragar is right. What you are doing is treason, And what the Merilith have done to the Astaria is what right my father tried to follow the rules. He obeyed the laws, and you saw what happened. Do you think Firil, who gave us the horn, intended that one tribe should be forever dominant? What's the point of the horn? Then the Merilith will never give up power. And who can hope to succeed in single combat against one Shakar? And Allison shared a look, and while it was slight, Nephron was certain he saw Allison nod. So what do you say? Nephron asked. Will you turn your back on Firil and learn to worship the Merilith as your new gods? Or will you trust me, a fellow in Steria who was raised to lead this tribe by a father who gave his life to save us from these so-called gods? Password. My jaw broke again. Petragus slurred. He'd only managed to make it back up to his knees and crouch on the ground, holding his face, tears in his eyes. Cigar turned fully around, but did not even look at Petragar. He faced the gathered in Staria and said, "The Fane has ordered us to apprehend or kill these Frey. Nephron asks us to stay our hands. The Fane is our ruler. The Galantians are our family. In this I am inclined to side with family, and I'm willing to recognize Nephron, son of Zephron, as the rightful lord of the Wrist." I concur, Allison said. "But as it is against the will of the Fane, no one can be ordered to do likewise." Sakara nodded and backed up, clearing the path to the bridge. "And the Galantians, any Frey who doesn't wish to defy the Fane's orders, you are free to draw your weapon and do what you believe is your duty." Sakar took a few more steps away from the bridge and made a show of waiting for those loyal to the Fane. Petrarch, still clutching his face, shifted his head. Looking around Oa, he shouted, "When no one moved, obey your Fane." Still no one moved. After several minutes of stillness and a silence that was broken only by the desperate outbursts of Petragar, Sykar nodded. "So be it." Then he turned back to Nephron. "Welcome back, my lord. What do you think that means?" Krogan asked. "When most of the Galantians and the defending Frey disappeared inside the gates of the fortress, only Tekken and Grigor walked back across the bridge. They didn't kill them." Lippet said, "That's got to be a good sign." As Persephone was already descending the narrow, dusty trail, wondering how fast she could safely move. She wanted to be at the bottom, wanted to learn what transpired, and was wondering why she'd climbed up in the first place. What happened? Moya was the first to greet her. Her big eyes loomed larger than usual. Did they fight? Did Suri do something? The mystic looked at her, surprised no to both questions. "But we don't know exactly what happened." Persephone slipped on a loose stone 2 feet from the bottom, stumbled, but landed safely on the hard scrubble plain. She touched down within the gathering of the chieftains' shields. They had all remained there after Wraith explained there wasn't room for everyone at the top. Tekken and Grigor are on their way back. I hope with good news. Tekken, yes. Moya. Persephone rolled her eyes. "Your boyfriend is fine. Just asking Madam Koenig," she said crisply. "Don't call me that. Everyone else does." "No, they don't." Persephone pushed past Oz, and Edgar grabbed the hem of her skirt and trotted down the slope to the road. From there she saw the 2 Galantians striding toward her. The gathered clansmen, a mixture of Rentire and Warwick men, flowed in behind. All curious for news, Madam Koenig Techen greeted her with a modest bow. Persephone scowled. "What happened? Where and what do you mean by that?" Techen made a lavish wave of his arm in the direction of Alan's wrist. "Welcome to your new fortress. I think you'll find it more suitable than East Puddle, my fortress." Tekken laughed. "Madame Koenig, weren't you watching? You just conquered Alan Wrist." Chapter 3. The Wrist. We traded dirt and rough-hewn logs for marble and glass. The Book of Bryn. The other times Persephone had been to Alan Wrist, she'd stuck close to Reglin, and neither were prone to wander. No one wandered inside Frey territory, much less in the heart of their principal stronghold, whose largest tower had come to symbolize a monolithic sentinel. During those early visits, the procession of chieftains marched across the Granford Gorge under guard. When the men were led to a meeting hall, the women, those allowed to come, waited in nearby rooms. Persephone had marveled at the lamps, windows, curtains, and furniture. She didn't dare set foot out of the little apartment. None of the women did. They weren't offered a midday meal, and all the Ruins ate the evening meal together on her second visit. Persephone and Galala, who she had assumed was Lipet's wife, only to later discover that she was his mistress, dared to climb the stairs to the window level, where they peered out at an unprecedented view of the Great Dome, the beautiful city below, and the massive tower that rose higher than she thought possible. No one had stopped them, no one so much as looked their way, but she'd been scared to death. They only had the courage to approach the one window but that view had stayed with her. She'd had dreams where she walked the city's paved streets, visiting the pillared shops. She was never frightened in her dreams. No one could see her. And somehow she knew this. Persephone had never once believed those dreams would come true in waking life. The day Nephron became Lord of Elanrist, he spent the afternoon providing Persephone with a personal tour of the fortress that would be her new home. The outpost wasn't as large as she had thought. The majestic fortification crowned the pinnacle of the crag, appearing as the inevitable conclusion to the natural rock. The city formed of lighter stone, and some would spilled out below. These smaller buildings trickled down the hillside in tiers, curling around the base of the butte like the tail of a dragon around a hoard of gold. And that as Mursulin Nephron pointed to a nondescript open door in a cluster of 3-story buildings, Land of Mirth. Nephron smiled in surprise. Your fray is very good, he nodded. Mursulin as he stopped walking and stood in the middle of the street, thinking, I don't know if you have such things in Roland. It's a place where people go to drink and sing songs and tell tales. We do that in our lodges. This is less formal a place. Common people can come and relax. Most enjoyable, the Galantians. And I spent many a long night in there. Seems small. Why come down here when you have that grand dome that I imagine could accommodate the whole town? The Varentian is our tribal chamber, our general assembly hall, a smaller version of the Varentian, where the leading officers of the various spears discuss issues and advise the wrist commander. Persephone smiled politely. I see you don't have a clue what I just said, do you? You said that dome building is your lodge, only you don't drink there. Nephron laughed. Okay, yes, I suppose that's about right. Wouldn't work in Ruland, she told him, as the two began walking again. Can't call a meeting if there isn't food and drink. No one would come. He laughed again, a nice laugh, she thought, and generous Persephone often saw humor and laughter, the good sort, as a gift that both the giver and receiver enjoyed equally. The humorless she viewed as miserly. Most of the men she knew were far too serious, which made Nephron a ray of sunshine through a grim canopy. The city wasn't at all like her dreams. The real thing was far less perfect and much more amazing. The complexity of twisting streets, paved in flat stones, the pretty arched bridges, the brightly painted multi-storied homes with their tall windows and dark wood trim were all things beyond her imagination. But she had been surprised to find piles of manure, broken pots, unconscious drunks sleeping on stoops, lewd graffiti, and the smell of urine, which was unmistakable on the narrower streets. But the biggest difference between dream and reality was that all the inhabitants could see her. Everyone stared. Those gathering water from the fountain forgot what they were doing. They stood frozen, watching as Nephron and Persephone passed. Conversations halted, doors closed, laughter died in every face. She saw fear mingled with revulsion and disbelief. One Frey openly cried. Nephron didn't appear to see any of it as he continued his tour, pointing out landmarks and curiosities in a proud, jauntly manner. I won't take you up there. He pointed toward a narrow lane that ran uphill underneath a bridge that joined to 3-story buildings. But there is a wonderful bathhouse up that way. Bathhouse where you go to bathe, to steam, to socialize. None of those words seem at all related. Another warm laugh. Persephone was apparently the goddess of humor that day. Trust me, it's very nice. You'll love it. I'm sure I will. She lied. They had returned to the stairs and were on their way back. The tour was coming to an end, but Persephone had a few questions she needed answered before they rejoined the rest. When they reached the first landing, they were alone, so she seized the opportunity. Nephron was a warrior, and she thought he'd appreciate a direct approach. So what happens now? Caught by surprise, Nephron turned to discover he'd left her behind. I thought I'd show you around the fortified areas, not the spy rock that takes too long to climb. But I think I mean, now that we've taken Elanrist. She tugged her index finger between them. What happens now? You're the king. You tell me I'm not an idiot, she said. This is a huge victory for you, for us. She rolled her eyes. This won't work if you continue to treat me like a child. He peered at her sidelong, his mouth partly open. He licked his lips, then his tongue lingered, touching his front teeth. You planned this, she said. Of course I did. You were there when no, you planned this before you ever came to Ren. He stopped. Again the contemplative stare. You've plotted this maneuver for months, maybe years, but you didn't count on me. You expected to be the king of the 10 clans. Still, Nephron didn't say anything, but his face shifted to genuine interest. Perhaps for the first time in her presence, she wanted to think there was respect as well. But maybe she saw only what she wanted when you came to Darren. You said you are outlawed because you wouldn't carry out the Fane's edicts and refused to destroy the rune dolls. You expressed outrage at the other Insteria who destroyed Diria and not at killing every villager. But I'm not buying that your assistance wasn't because of moral outrage over the slaughter of innocents he didn't try to refute. So she went on, I don't know, maybe you do have a genuine aversion to butchering women and children, or perhaps killing is a mindless habit for you, as easy to do as it is for Padera to snap the neck of a chicken, but you didn't give up your heritage. Leave all the she gestured at the city, because a few houses were burned, a few babies killed. Such an act would take far more compassion than I think you're capable of feeling. Honestly, I don't care. What I do care about is what your plans are. Now, how do you see this grand adventure of yours playing out? How do you think I see it? Persephone stepped to the handrail and looked down on the roof of a home. They had a flower and vegetable garden on top. The plants were doing well for such a hot summer. I think this bloodless victory, the capture of a fortress that my people believe to be impregnable, establishes you as a worthy hero among the 10 clans. You're gaining trust and allegiance. Another similar success, and you might not need me at all. You might already feel I'm unnecessary. She looked behind her. And these stairs are very steep. They are, he said, then surprised her by holding out his hand. She stared at it suspiciously. He smiled at her hesitation, lowered his hand, and began to nod. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, but I'm probably not the only one to underestimate you. I suppose I could lie. I could insist you are wrong and reaffirm my devotion to the cause of saving the ruins, but I suspect you'd see through that you're a hard woman to lie to. No, people have no trouble lying to me. The hard part is making me believe. So what happens next? What are your plans for me? Nephren ran fingers through his hair, leaving his hand to linger on the back of his neck. Okay, I was planning to tell you this in a more appropriate time and place. He looked around the steps and shrugged, but since you insist, it was my hope to marry you. Persephone's mouth dropped open, conquering the premier phrase, stronghold, in a matter of minutes without the loss of a single life, paled in comparison to her shock at that single sentence. Marry me, you do that right? Ruins have marriage, yes we do. But we, she once more toggled her finger between them. Why not? Don't tell me there is a ruin law against that too. She opened her mouth, but the number of possible ways to answer that question jammed in their flood to escape and left her speechless. In Frey society, most marriages are arrangements of convenience. They advance social status, grant access to certain circles, form needed alliances. Rarely are they romantic. This is what I'm proposing. He's proposing to win this war. We need to join forces. I need credibility in the eyes of the clans. Without it, I have no means to fight. You need the support of the Astoria, which I can obviously provide. My recognized authority will bring all the Evelyn outposts to heal. Our marriage would bind these two otherwise antagonistic groups into an extremely effective and overwhelming force. Your numbers, my guidance and resources. He wove his fingers together in front of him. Together we would become the knot at the confluence of two ropes, forming a line strong enough to pull up the whole world, or enough rope to hang ourselves. With that too, he smiled. There was an amazing power about him, and his smile was warm, friendly, inviting. But is it genuine? Well, at least he's not treating me like a child anymore. There's no need to give an answer now. I'd prefer if you didn't. Like I said, this wasn't the time and place of my choosing. Let's get settled and get to know each other better. Then we can revisit the topic. He's really pouring on the charm, and yet she found his practical approach appealing. She had rejected Wraith's overtures because they were based on selfish desire. He wanted her all to himself, for them to run away and live a fantasy on a hill overlooking the Urim River. She had no doubt Wraith loved her. She remembered what that looked like, how it felt. But love was for the young, the innocent, and the stupid. She couldn't see herself putting those blinkers on again. She had a job to do, and that was more important than her own happiness. She held no illusions about Nephren, and he appeared to see her just as clearly. Persephone had little interest in being a wife again, but a partner, an equal partner. That was something else. She looked at the Frey Lord approvingly. He was more than attractive. He was beautiful, godlike, and yet if he tried to kiss her, she thought she might scream. They weren't even the same race. The whole idea was absurd, and yet his logic was irrefutable. Come on, he said, we need to get back. I don't want Moya hunting me down with that giant Bow of hers, thank you, she told him. He paused, puzzled for telling me the truth. She explained. He smiled again, a nice smile. That's where I used to live. Malcolm pointed at a beautiful home, its door ornamented with a bronze handle and a decorative knocker in the shape of a sword striking a shield. Wraith had never seen anything like it aside from the countless other homes they had passed. The street was perfectly straight and paved in flat stones with such precision that no weeds could grow between. The cracks, the only visible dirt to be found, was packed in planters, which produce vegetables and herbs. You live there? Tesh asked. That's Shigen's old house. Merrill and I both worked here. He didn't need two servants after his wife left, but he kept us both on anyway. You lived here, and you ran away. Tesh's eyes widened. Is the inside a fancy torture chamber, or something? The inside is lovely, an artful clover motif reflected in the curved archways, as well as the spring colors. Tesh just stared at him. Malcolm chuckled. I wasn't there long. I used to serve in the fortress. They both looked up toward the Spy Rock. That's what Malcolm called the insanely tall watchtower linked to the cape by a giant bridge. Upon seeing it for the first time, Gifford had described the tower as looking like Martha had been tending her garden and left her shovel jammed in the dirt. That's what the potter meant to say, at least. But because of his inability to pronounce the O sound, what he said was, looks like Mother left a shovel in the garden. That's where they tortured you? Tesh asked. In the fortress. No one mistreated me, didn't even beat you, no starved you. Malcolm shook his head and frowned. They must have done something pretty awful for you to run from this. I know families who'd sell their firstborn to live here again. Tesh looked at Wraith, who supported him with a nod, having already gone through this conversation with Malcolm. Wraith wasn't as shocked, but there was a difference between what he'd pictured and reality. Usually Wraith's imagination outstripped the real world. Not this time. Tesh had worried eyes, as if this was the part of the dream where monsters closed in and a door to safety refused to open. He had that look ever since they crossed the Granford Bridge. The kid was swimming in a pool of deadly snakes, waiting for the first one to bite. Wraith understood. He felt it too. These were their enemies, the evil gods who'd butchered their people, and he and Tesh were strolling their streets as if they owned the place. They didn't. The 10 clans had done nothing to earn this right. The Frey had invited them, and spiders did the same to flies. How many families live there with you? Tesh asked. None, Malcolm replied. Just Shigen, me, and Merrill. The ex-slave tilted his head with a puzzled look. The plants are doing well. I wonder who lives there now. What made Shigen leave the fortress? Wraith asked him. Shigen was never in the fortress. He was from the Ascendwar tribe. Not in the guard. Very few. Nan and Staria are. I thought you said you were in the fortress. Oh yes, Malcolm nodded. I had a different master. Then he sold you. Died. You of all people should know. Frey do that. How old was he? Malcolm shrugged. 15. 16 maybe. That young. 115 or 1600. Oh okay, I always wondered how long they lived. He didn't die of old age. Accident. Wraith looked up at the walkways between the massive tower and the dome. A fall from either of them would kill anyone. He was killed in combat. Wraith couldn't imagine what sort of beings killed Frey prior to him. At least giants, goblins, a dragon likely. It was something he'd never heard of. Seeing the inside of Alan Rist made Wraith realize how limited his understanding of the world was. The three paused at the city square near a big well with a little roof to protect those using it from sun or rain. How long did it take them to build all this? Tesh asked. Malcolm shrugged. 1,000 years or so. It's so beautiful. Where are all the people hiding? Malcolm dipped a hand into the fountain's pool and wiped his face. The barbarians have entered the gates. The residents have no idea what might happen. This is unprecedented and likely terrifying. They're scared. Tess said. The elves are scared of us when we arrive by the thousands, and the Rist's guards let us wander their streets. Yes, these people have been told that we're wild, little more than mindless animals. I suppose they expect we're here to loot, pillage, and burn. So goes the planting, so comes the harvest. Wraith said. He stood up on the rim of the well and looked out. The place was fine, to be sure, but a bit too orderly. This was a home built by warriors for warriors. It lacked the flowers and winding paths have run to the south over the orange clay roofs. He located the river gorge at Granford. The Burn River flowed through a canyon. Somewhere down that way, the Burn joined forces with the Urim at a place known as the Forks. The place he'd buried his father. The Gullah still might have a mind to do a bit of pillaging. I suspect That's why Nephren asked them to remain camped in what's left of Dariah. Malcolm said not going to like that, probably disappointed there was no battle. I know several who are looking forward to killing those they previously believed to be gods. I just can't believe the elves are scared of us, Tesh said. Frey Wraith corrected, these ones are on our side now, at least that's the story Nephren is spreading. Not all of them are frightened, Tesh said, pointing in the direction of the house Malcolm had lived in. Wraith recognized Merrill, Malcolm's one-time partner in servitude, the coward who'd ridden away while screaming murder, murderer. Merrill stepped out of the to be true house, and leaving the door wide took 4 steps. This left him still in the front yard, still behind the little decorative wall. He glared at them from his tiny battlement. Merrill. Malcolm greeted him happily and walked over. Murderer, Merrill shouted back in Frey. Malcolm stopped. I didn't kill. Wraith didn't catch everything they said. They spoke quickly in Frey. All he caught were the words bloodthirsty, cannibalism, and monsters. He wasn't even certain of those due to Merrill's thick accent. Malcolm was trying to calm his old roommate. Wraith didn't need to understand the words to know that, but Merrill was having none of it. He shouted his replies and grew more red-faced with each round. Before long he was slapping the top of the wall. Other doors opened, ghostly faces materialized at windows. Frey couples appeared on balconies from the 3rd floor of what looked to be a leather shop. Wraith heard a reedy Frey say, please come away, it's dangerous. More were coming out, standing on stoops with folded arms, stiff lips, and nodding heads. Maybe we should move on, Wraith said. Let's head back and find Moya and Tekajine, or maybe Roan needs a hand with the wagons. Wraith tugged on Malcolm's sleeve. The ex-slave waved back at him with one hand. As he did, Ruth noticed another pair of eyes looking down from the upper story window of Merrill's house. Remembering Malcolm's question about who lived there now, Wraith tilted his head up for a better look, and the figure withdrew into the shadows. All that remained was the flutter of a curtain. It took a full-out drag by his wrist to get Malcolm walking, but Wraith outweighed his friend by no small amount, and Malcolm soon gave in to the idea. Idiot, Malcolm grumbled. He has completely forgotten who he is. He actually thinks being a slave is a privilege. A privilege, can you believe that? And he refuses to even admit he's human, or ruin, as he so derisively refers to us. The little partisan bigot traitor is what he is. Malcolm marched up the street with loud slaps of his feet. You used to think of us as ruins too. That's before I knew better. Malcolm jabbed his pointed finger at Wraith. See right there, I can be reasoned with, but not him. Oh no, not Merrill, the little weasel. He thinks he knows everything, except that he's no better than anyone else. I honestly don't know how the man manages to dress himself in the morning. Malcolm continued to fume, but more quietly, as they rounded a wall painted with crude images. So did you find out who his new master is? Doesn't have one. Malcolm said he empties chamber pots and cleans out cells in the dojon. Now not too happy about the change, blames me for tarnishing his otherwise impeccable reputation. I don't know what he's complaining about. He still gets to live in one of the best houses in the city, and he has the whole place to himself. Then who was that in there with him? Merrill made it very clear he was alone. And how it was my fault. He was now a pariah. I saw someone upstairs. Malcolm looked at him skeptically. Really? Why would Merrill lie about something like that? Ray shrugged. Take it up with him. Next time, we never come down here again. Okay, Nephren just gifted us this pretty place. Might not be a good idea to get exiled before we've tasted the veal. This made Malcolm smile. They do have wonderful view. Chapter for Council of the King. Persephone was my hero. I'm proud to say she was also my friend. Nearly a second mother. She was also the king. But that was just a word, just a title that did not mean anything until she stood beneath that dome, and we heard the thunder of her voice. The book of Bryn Nephron called the meeting. Persephone told them they needed to sit down and talk with representatives of Alan Ritz, as well as discuss future plans with the other chieftains. They had only ruled the Frey fortress for 4 days, and already there was talk of the coalition breaking up. Many saw the surrender of Alnrist as a job well done and a problem solved. She Nephron and the chieftains rode a wave of goodwill, but the men were tired of standing around and wanted to get back to their farms, livestock, wives and children. What they didn't realize, what she needed to explain, was what Nephron had explained to her. This wasn't the end, it wasn't even the beginning. All they had done was shift position to higher ground. The first battle was still coming. Persephone had imagined the Meeting would be similar to those she held at the lodge in Dowran, where a dozen men would gather around a fire and roast a lamb. She would sit in her chair and shout over the noise of belchers and the bellows for more drink. If left to her, Persephone would have ordered a fire and a spit built and a barrel of beer rolled out in the middle of the lower courtyard in open space between the front gate and the general barracks. But she hadn't called the meeting. Nephron had the Lord of the Wrist. Dressed in an uncharacteristically elegant long shirt, blue cape, and sporting gold arm and wrist bands, escorted Persephone into the Verentian tears of seats climbed the walls like the sides of a giant bull, granting everyone a clear view. Over the heads of those in front waiting for her were hundreds of men, and Frey Nephron led her down a central aisle that descended with wide steps to the bottom. Streaming shafts of sunlight entered through the strategically placed skylights, illuminating a raised dais. That's why he was so adamant about the time of the meeting. She had wanted it at night, but he insisted on just after midday. Realizing that Nephron was leading her to that platform, she began to panic. This wasn't something she was used to. Persephone had experienced speaking with a handful of familiar men, but this was another matter altogether. What's more, there was no chair. She'd always had a chair. The chair had been the greatest symbol of her position, more important than the torch. She felt diminished without it, smaller as she was forced to stand before all those seated at a higher elevation. She didn't feel in command, but rather like an accused criminal brought forth for questioning. In the front rows sat all the chieftains, including the Gullah, alongside several dignified-looking Frey she'd never seen before. Moya was there, to bow in hand, standing just off to the side and out of the light as the shield to the king. Only she bore a weapon. Moya didn't say a word as Persephone passed, but she expressed a wide-eyed exclamation that Persephone knew would have been a slew of profanity if the two had been alone. Nephron walked with her as she climbed the remaining series of platforms, but then he stopped. He too remained in the shadows, urging her to step forward to the white-hot column of light that entered at an angle and lit the stage. Pressing quivering hands against her sides, she took those 5 remaining steps. The moment she entered the light, the dome erupted in applause. The sound scared her nearly to death. She almost backed off, but forced herself to take deep breaths and straighten up. This is no time to be seen as a troll. She waited for the turmoil to calm, then opened her mouth. I am Persephone, the king of the 10 clans. She stopped, stunned. The sound of her voice boomed with godly volume and silenced any remaining applause. She hadn't even spoken that loudly. She looked around, bewildered. The dome said someone in the second row. It was Malcolm, who pointed up stupidly. She looked above her, then smiled and nodded, and this time she mouthed the words "thank you." Hardly a sound was made as the audience awaited her next syllable. A few people coughed, but the sound was muted, as if they were in another room. She swallowed and began again. I am Persephone, the king of the 10 clans, and I've called this meeting to explain a few things and to hear any problems or concerns you might have. Her voice wavered slightly, and she took another breath. The Astoria of Alan Rist have graciously agreed to act as our hosts in our efforts to stand against the aggression of the famed Frey. Law bestowed by their god Firil prohibits them from taking another Frey life. As a result, they will not join our cause as active warriors, but they will also not seek to jeopardize or undermine it. She stared at the 7 Frey in the front row, all of whom nodded. She smiled and nodded back. Step 1 complete. Now a number of men have spoken to me about going home. They have fields that need attention, animals that need tending, and trust me, we need you to do those things. An army is only as good as its supply of food. Nephron had given her that line during their today preparation. Seeing the very serious nods of approval from both the Frey as well as the Gullah, she understood why. Credibility. She was still earning it. We need you to keep farming. As much as I would like this victory to be the end of our troubles, it isn't the first battle of this war has yet to be fought. Now that we've moved into his command fortress, the Thane must act. He will send a force to dislodge us, and make no mistake, that force will be powerful and determined. It will take every last man, every sword, every ounce of will. We have to weather it. But she paused, letting the thunder of her booming voice fade. We don't know when that day will come. It could be next week or next year, and we can't afford to let Field's life fallow. So here is my plan. I am told that Alan Rist already has a system of signal fires built between here and Irvingen, their outpost in the far north. I am ordering that we extend this system building additional wood piles in the High Spear Valley in the east and south. To tire in this way, many of you will be able to return home. But if scouts learn of an impending attack, I will order the signals to be lit, and this will be the sign for all able-bodied warriors to return. There were fewer nods, but no one complained now. Not everyone can go, and not everyone can stay when they get home. We need to train Nephrin his Scythians, and many of their fellow Instaria have volunteered to teach us how to fight. We already know how to fight, one of the Gullah shouted, but his voice was a mouse squeak compared to hers. They can make us better, she said, and you'll become familiar with new weapons. My good friend Roan and a network of smiths trained by her will be working night and day to forge swords made of iron, a magical metal that is stronger than copper and bronze. She will also oversee the making of armor, shields, and helms. What about the bow? Someone farther back shouted. Will we get to learn that? Persephone looked at Moya and smiled. Indeed, but it will require making hundreds of bows and thousands of arrows. Another reason why we need men to stay. We will work in shifts. I will send home groups of men for a month at a time. Then they will return and others will leave. We'll make sure to stagger the groups, so every village will always have some men able to work communal fields. And I will establish supply routes, using wagons to haul food, salt, wood, and will more nodes, fewer folded arms. We need to work together to prepare. We must remain committed to the path we've started down. It's essential that we trust one another, and if we can do that together, we will survive. That was the end of her speech, but only Nephrin knew it, so there was an awkward pause. Persephone wasn't certain what to do in the past. She just sat back in her chair, drank from a cup, or began eating. How does one get off this stage? Nephrin came to her rescue by clapping. This ignited applause in the audience. Sadly, Persephone noticed it too. Was muted. Chapter 5. The Giant and the Hobgoblin. Even to this day, we do not know much about Mondolet, which is unfortunate, since I still can't decide whether in the grand scheme of things he was a hero or a villain. The Book of Brian. His name was Sile, and he went everywhere. Fane Lothian did. Montau couldn't remember the other one's name, the female. Not that he needed to. Both of his father's new bodyguards were silent watchers who weren't inclined to conversation. Sile was unusually large. One delay would go so far as to call him grotesque, and he harbored doubts that the hulking guard was Frey at all. Sile had a large head, broad and endowed with a protruding brow that cast shadows on his eyes. His jaw was a hinged shovel, and his ears lacked a traditional teardrop-shaped. Mondolet secretly suspected Sile was a diminutive member of the Grammarian race. He even carried a battle-axe. Sile certainly wasn't Mirrorleaf. Nana Gullah completed his survey of the damage this morning, Amali told the Thane, as all 5 of them stood on the steps of the Arenthian. How long until you resume meetings? He is confident his people will have it back in order in a month. A month? Are you certain? It wouldn't be better to have them relieved? The Thane's comment lost confidence when facing Imali's growing frown. The curator, still sporting a cast on her leg and a sling on her arm, had a way of cowing everyone with her disapproval, even Lothian. I know you mean well, she told him, but given the circumstances, I think it would be wise to follow traditional roles and allow the Elwyn to handle the restoration. I think the Arenthian has seen enough of the Merilith's art for a while. A month, he repeated. The stairs in the plaza continued to bear the scars of battle. Scorch marks blackened the nearby walls, and the eastern steps were still missing. The paint in the market that had looked so much like blood had been cleaned up. An ancient tree was gone from the plaza, but the remaining stump still smelled of sawdust. To one side of the gathered group, the deer in the fountain had yet to be repaired. Its severed stone legs were all that remained. Weeks had passed since the revolt. The days had flown, blurred in a smear of anxiety. Monduli had lost weight. A lot of people had. Amali looked thinner too, and paler. We are free, Emily said. We do things slowly. It's just frustrating. The Thane frowned. I want it cleaned up. I want this whole episode erased and forgotten so we can move on. The curator of the Aquila gave him a strange smile. I believe that is exactly what the surviving members of the Aquila and the tribes they serve are afraid of. My Thane, these scars serve to remind the Mirrorleaf of the need for restraint, so they don't want this particular corpse buried too soon. Wanderly's father scowled, but nodded. Just the same, how bad is it inside? The Thane began to climb the steps, and everyone followed, including the giant Sile and the other one, the girl whose name he still couldn't remember. She was short and ugly, not claw your own eyes out ugly, not even run ugly, but revolting enough that Mandalay didn't bother remembering her name. She was supposed to be a gifted artist. The word he kept hearing was fast, apparently Miss What's Her Name. Had been in the plaza the day of the attack and done something right, not as bad as it could have been. Amley allowed her sight to focus on Montadele. The Fane saw it too and acted as if he had forgotten his son was there. Oh right, Wandala waited until his father looked away before frowning and shaking his head ever so slightly. Miss What's Her Name was the talk of Estremondan, but he Mondalet, who had saved the most important landmark in the city and the lives of most of the Aquila, was lauded with such lofty praise as O'Right Wanderly turned to discover that the girl had seen his reaction. Tiny little hobgoblin sees everything. Any news from Roland? Amley asked. Not yet, the Fane replied, taking care to avoid a shattered step. I am told such things require preparation, and that the Insteria have yet to begin culling the ruined hall. He gestured around them. Apparently that tribe shares the same lightning-fast response to my decrees as the Elwyn. Amley nodded with that same stoic calm she always used when speaking to his father. Montaigne imagined she was making an assortment of lewd mental gestures. I hear there are something close to 1 million rooms, she said, mindless but dangerous animals. It seems perhaps you should have addressed their numbers centuries ago, before they took root. Now it will take years to exterminate them. My Fane, a voice called from behind them. Everyone turned to see Voskic frozen in mid-step at the bottom of the stairs. His mouth was open, his eyes locked. He held one hand up, a finger pointing toward the sky, dressed all in gray. He could have been a new stature, really. Sign Lothian said. He's a trusted advisor, which is why he's not dead. Your greatness, the hobgoblin explained. Sign, that is her name. Release him as you wish. Bosick stumbled, sighed, and adjusted his ascar before resuming his climb up the stairs. My Fane, he gave a tentative glance at Sign. I have news. What is it? Bosick looked at the others and hesitated. It's not good, my Fane. Montalay's father frowned. He turned to face Amali and sighed. See, they clean this up. With that, the Fane and Voschik marched back down the stairs, followed by Sile and Sign the giant and the hobgoblin. Amali turned to Montadele. What do you think? He shrugged. Probably nothing. Bask jumps at shadows all the time, even more often as of late, with good reason, don't you think? Amali adjusted the sling on her shoulder. Montalai couldn't be certain if this was meant to illustrate her point or if she was merely uncomfortable. Mandalay always had to be wary of her. Amali often used insinuations that he didn't always understand. This was partly why he found speaking to her interesting. Their conversations were little puzzles to work out. There were times after concluding a talk that he went home, thought about it, and realized he'd gotten the discussion all wrong. I don't know, maybe Montaigne didn't like being too definitive. He loathed revealing a position, fearing it would be the wrong one. Somehow he had managed to impress the curator of the Aquarior, who so often impressed everyone else, and he very much enjoyed having someone respect him. Wondra feared opening his mouth and ruining everything. Aren't you curious? Amali tilted her head toward the Fane, who was crossing the square, heading back toward the Talwara, with Fasik whispering into his ear, not really, still angry at him. Montalai didn't answer. She continued to stare. Amali wasn't going to let this go. He sided with Vidar, Montaigne said, not because he felt he couldn't avoid answering, but because he wanted to. He was angry and wanted to voice his outrage, even if it might mean appearing petty or childish. Don't you think Vidar deserved some compensation? The fray was nearly executed for something he didn't do. It's still embarrassing. I saved the whole building and everyone in it, and my reward is expulsion. You weren't expelled, replaced. It's the same thing. No, it's not, and you know it. Besides, would you have wanted Vidar as your senior again, to go back to being the junior counselor? Montreal shook his head. He hadn't thought of that. The idea sickened him. There you are. It wasn't a career for you, just a learning experience, and I'd say you learned a great deal, more than your father ever intended. What's more, you endeared yourself to the Aquila. They won't forget your heroism. Most owe you their lives, and when you become Fane, you'll discover that goodwill to be invaluable. Amali sat down on the steps, taking care not to bang her arm. Sitting there wasn't unusual. Many Frey sat on the stairs that led to the Arthenian, enjoying the view it afforded of the plaza and the river. Some even picnicked or taught classes there, taking advantage of the natural amphitheater it created. Montpellier just found it odd that she would sit there. The difficulty Amali had in getting up and down more than validated his sense that such an act wasn't natural for her. When you think of it, Amli said leaving the Aquila is the best thing that could have happened. You made friends that day, and now you won't have the opportunity to lose them. Wonderly looked at her, stunned on multiple levels. First, he wasn't aware of having any friends except perhaps Amali herself, and he felt presumptuous for even having the thought. The day after the rebellion, Wonderla had hidden himself away, terrified of seeing anyone who had been in the Arenthian that day. He was certain they hated him. After all, he had been the one who invited Macareta second. If he did have these phantom friends, why would he risk losing them by staying? She must have noticed his expression, because she added, right now you're a hero and everyone will remember you that way. But if you stayed a member of the Aquila, well, familiarity erodes pedestals. Eventually, you'd be on the wrong side of an argument. We all are at some point, and your legend would diminish this way. Mondale, savior of the Aquila, will remain Dane and perfect. What more could a future Fane want? He smiled and sat down beside her. The old lady had a way of making things seem better. He felt bad about her arm, the way she clutched it. I can fix that for you. Her eyes widened, and she leaned back. No, thank you. She caught herself and took a breath. I mean, that's very generous, but I'm old-fashioned. I prefer to let nature take its course. You're just scared. She raised her brows, and with her good hand Amali indicated the devastation of the battlefield memorial around them. Absolutely. I was offering to fix your arm, not challenging you to combat, and I wasn't rebuking you, but I'm aware of the inherent complications that can result from taking shortcuts. They looked down at the market. Only a few of the vendors had returned. Those that were brave enough to do so had little business. People had shifted most of their shopping to stands along the greenway since the battle. Florella Plaza had become a haunted place fit only for ghosts. Montreal's sight was naturally pulled to a familiar spot where once stood a stand that sold outlandish paintings, melodramatic landscapes of the frontier, created by those with imagination rather than first-hand knowledge. Did they find her, Emily asked. Montpelier continued to stare at the empty square, at the sawdust and the rubble. No, not that I've heard. Have you looked? No. You liked her. A lot of people liked her. Then she went insane and tried to kill my father. That has a tendency to change things, but you still want to see her. She's probably dead. Saying the words was harder than he would have thought, and afterward he swallowed twice. They never found a body. He looked at Amali, then Merilith. Don't always leave bodies, he anticipated. Or perhaps fear instead. Amli appeared amused. Such the expert in magical combat now, are we? I went to ruin with Grindel was there when he dueled Orion. That wiped the smile from her face, but once again she failed to respond with the awe and fear he deserved. Amli looked concerned in a maternal sort of way, worry creasing her brow. Was it awful? Montaigne nearly laughed. It was amazing. Grindel was such a master. I miss him. Amali didn't say anything for a moment, then asked, so how's the new tutor? What your father was just telling me about his desire for you to resume your studies. I thought you already had. Montreal was aghast. I have to go. He stood up. Montreal, she raised a hand to stop him. He reached down and pulled her up. Thank you. Montreal started to turn, but she held on to him. No, I mean thank you for everything, she said in a soft voice, and then she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. A month ago he would have recoiled. A month ago he would have scrubbed his face with a bristle brush, but a month ago he'd never served in the Aquila, nor held up a building, while rebellion raged around him. A month ago he didn't have the respect of one of the highest-ranking officials in the city. Now, as he trotted down the steps, he smiled. Mandalai stormed onto the East Palace balcony, where his father Vasek Vidar and Tirane were holding an impromptu meeting in the summer sun. The senior officer of the Lion Corps stood awkward and stiff, his helm under one arm, listening intently as Vasek droned on about something. I've just learned I'm to have a new. This was all Montreal got out before he was blown onto his back. Sign, that's my son, Lafayette barked, without nearly enough conviction or outrage to suit one to delay. I don't think he's here to kill me. Monlay lay moaning. The floor of the Talabara was tiled in marble, and he'd landed on one hip and an elbow. Oh, get up, boy, she hit you with wind, not a bolt of lightning. Wonderlake crawls to his feet and sneers at Sign. She had lost interest in him, dismissed him as no one of importance. If he returned the blow, she'd fly off the balcony and into the Chinois River. If she was lucky, he considered it, even chose the sounds and movements which would be required to summon a good strong gust, but his father's voice was already raised, and Montaigne had another more pressing issue still. He was embarrassed and more than a little angry to be knocked on his backside by a diminutive goblin girl whom he hadn't heard of until after the Grey Cloak revolt. He also felt the fight to be unfair. He hadn't heard the attack, he'd had no warning, and as a result no time to defend himself. Thinking about it, he hadn't heard her freeze Voskik either, and she'd been just behind Montaigne. At the time, she's fast, that's all there is to it. The girl is fast and apparently silent. Call a general assembly of the Shaddy, his father told for a sec, and let Casimel know I want to see him. Shaddy, Montaigne said, coming to the balcony on the side that was opposite. Sign, why assemble the general army? We have the Astaria. Alan Reist has been taken. The Fane said, we'll need to reform the Spider Corps. It's been too long since the Merilith went to war. Alan Bristle was. Montague was certain he hadn't heard correctly, or that his father had misspoken. He sometimes did. Old people had dusty minds that didn't always work right. They forgot where they put things, called people by their wrong names, and while they could remember an incident from 1,000 years ago with perfect clarity, they had no idea what they had eaten for breakfast that morning. His father at once called him charm, mixing him up with his servant. Of all people, clean the wax from your ears, boy. His father growled. The runes surrounded the fortress and took it. But that's not possible, they're just runes. Mondi protested. Runes LED by Nephron and Orion. I suspect. The Fane looked at Voskik. Voskik nodded. Information is still coming in. What we know is that thousands of runes, both Gullah and Rulan, swept up from the south and surrounded Granford. Within hours, the Instaria Guard surrendered. The Instari don't surrender. Wandalai said, those people are fanatical about combat. You visited them once, and now you're the expert, are you? His father shook his head. Nephron is the son of their tribal leader, Terene said, after all those years of isolation on the frontier. It's possible the Unstardius loyalty tipped more toward one of their own and away from your father. The door at the end of the corridor opened with a bang and immediately slammed shut again. Cries of pain were followed by unintelligible cursing. My Fane, Hatteras called out, let them inside. The Fane told her an instant later. The door swung free. Hatteras and Rigorous entered, one tall and the other short. The two were almost always together, usually drinking. Neither was Merilith, so Montala knew no more about them than their faces and names. You stand for us, my Fane? Hatteras asked. His voice was muffled as he rubbed his cheek where the door had hit it. We have a problem, the Fane explained. I ordered the Astoria to invade Rulain and destroy the ruins. Instead, Nephron has yoked them into his service, and just like he did with the Grey Cloaks, he's managed to seduce the Astoria to revolt against me. He's taken control of Alan Rist. Both Frey returned blank faces, as if they had only understood every other word, since they weren't. Merleaf Wandella wasn't surprised. His father would likely need to draw pictures. What do you want us to do, my Fane? Hatteras asked. The son of my challenger has stolen my army. He has my fortress, and I suspect he's bent on revenge. What do you think I want? We are going to war you. Fools, I want an army of my own. Hatteras, you'll raise and command the Bear Legion. Rigorous, the Volf. Both men looked terrified. Our people will be no match for the Instaria in combat. Hatteras said, we aren't certain the Instaria have agreed to break Farrell's law. Vasek added, the Grey Cloaks had no such concern. The Fane shot back harshly enough to surprise even Vasek. His father's advisor nodded, conceding the point, but added, I just mean that as warriors they place a high value on entering a legion. This may be enough to deter them. It doesn't matter, the Fane said. I am also reinstating the Spider Corps. Casimir Dale will lead them. The Fane waited for a response from Hatteras and Rigorous. When none came, he added, you and your troops will be mostly for show support and clean up. The Spider Corps will do the heavy work. They both nodded, but looked even less confident than before. This needs to be stopped, and quickly. The Fane said, I want it over. There will be no half measures. No one is exempt. I want 1,000 ready to march by spring. 2,000. Hatteras looked shocked. By spring, Terranet said. Is that a problem? Bethane asked. Terranet looked to Voskik with desperate eyes. We left the defense of Eraven to the Instaria. We only have the Lion Corps and the Shardi on this side of the Midwold, and even combined, they aren't much of an army, and training new recruits takes time. You have until spring. What do we need an army for? Wonderlay said, we are Merilith, so what would you do, boy? Wish them out of existence? You have that kind of power, do you? His father was more than angry. He bordered on rage. Can you snap your fingers and make thousands of people who are hundreds of miles away vanish? Did your idol Grendel teach you this miracle? During your 2-week jaunt to Rollane, the same trip, when he got his head chopped off, I'm seeing a bit of a problem with your counsel. Mondare was so shocked by his father's tone that he took 2 steps backward, bumping into Sile. His father had never spoken to him like that before. He rarely raised his voice, and Wandela found himself frightened that Lothian might lose control and do something he wouldn't regret until later. If then the Fane walked to the balcony and leaned on the railing. He stared down for several minutes. No one else moved or spoke. Wonderly imagined that even the songbirds went silent for fear of further angering the Fane. At last Lothian turned tatter. Nay, my Fane, the phrase snuck to attention. You will make me a new army. The members of your line corps will train the new recruits for the Bear and Volf legions. You will inform Minister Metis regarding your needs for weapons and armor. Let her know this is now her tribe's top priority. By spring, I will have to trained and equipped warriors ready to march west. Is that understood? Yes, my Fane. Everyone replied with luck. They won't be needed. But luck hasn't been on my side recently. The others filed out quickly, eager to get to work or just happy to get away. Montreal was left alone with his father Sile and Sign. He wished they would leave too, but of course they wouldn't. He hadn't seen the Fane's double shadows leave his side since the attack. Why are you still here? What do you want? Wantley remembered about the news of the tutor, but it was trivial now. I wanted to go, he said, before even thinking. Go where? With you. When the army is ready, you'll be leading it, won't you? The Fane narrowed his eyes and stared at his son as if Wonderla had changed colors or spun his head around in a complete circle. Yes, he replied. How did you know? That just makes sense. You sent Orion, and she failed. Sent Grendel and me, and we failed. You sent the giants, and they failed. You want it done right this time. His father was nodding. I want to go. Why? He considered explaining his desire for revenge for his idol's death, but then reconsidered. His father would most likely think he should be his son's idol, so Montaigne took another tack. The Frayed don't go to war often. If I'm to be Fane one day, I should see it, understand it. Your mother took you to the Battle of Mador when you were young. That's why you know how to deal with this. If I don't go, if I miss the chance to experience battle, how will I know how to handle my own future conflicts? His father studied him as if baffled by what he'd just heard. He glanced out the window, then back at his son. Admirable. You do understand that if you were to stay here and I were to be killed on the field of battle, you'd be Fane, the youngest one ever, assuming you won against whomever blew the horn in challenge. Going with me is risky. You could die. I'm not afraid. No, I can see that. I suppose you're too young to worry about death. It's not even a possibility in your mind. Or if it is, you see your end as some heroic accomplishment and take pleasure in cementing your place in history. Lothian rubbed his hands together, palms sliding against palm. Getting older, Montreal, is like climbing a mountain. The higher you go, the greater the view. From time to time, you look back at such heights. You can see paths behind you, the trails you took, and the ones you foolishly disregarded, the blind alleys you fortunately missed purely out of chance rather than by some greater wisdom on your part. You also spot others following you, people making the same stupid decisions. From your elevated position, you witness their bad choices, the ones they can't see because they aren't standing where you are. You could shout down, attempt to warn them, but they rarely listen. They are too blinded by the indisputable fact that the path you followed got you where you are, to the place they want to be. His father stared then as if waiting for a reply, but Montaigne had no idea what his father had been babbling about. Maybe he wasn't saying anything dusty-minded. After all, older people just talked sometimes. Maybe hearing their own voice was reassuring to them somehow. Yes, you can come, the Fane said, at last, sounding disappointed. You can go to war. Mondale smiled, but you'll be precious little used to me. Without an education, the smile vanished. I've enrolled you at the Academy of the Art. Thinking his father had appointed a new tutor was bad enough, but this was out of the question. The Academy, Montalia said, stunned. But that's for I'm the prince. I don't belong in a public school. That's exactly where you belong. The Fane took a step toward his son. You need a formal education in the art, and tutors haven't been working out well for you or them. But at the Academy, Mundare was horrified at being forced to practice, to take more stupid lessons, and this time in front of an audience. How can I, your son, attend art school? That's so wrong you do know about the academy, right? Montalith rolled his eyes. I know it's no place for the son of the Fane. Lothian laughed. You are aware of how the school came to be? Mondolay thought a moment. This was one of those things he felt. He ought to know, but for some reason, he couldn't recall if he'd ever learned that particular fact. By the way his father was acting, Mondolay had missed something important. He gave up. No, his father let out a small huff that Mondale couldn't translate. He didn't sound upset, but he didn't sound thrilled either. If anything, the Fane appeared mildly amused. The school was founded by Puridian. Wandala stared at his father, who stared back with enough expectation in his eyes to make Wandala nervous. Oh, by the face of Farrell, you have no idea what I'm talking about, do you? Montaigne slowly shook his head. He didn't like it that Sile and Sign were listening. Not that he cared about Sile. The giant didn't look capable of understanding which object in the sky was the sun and which was the moon. Sign was another matter. Montratchett didn't want to look stupid in front of her, and he felt he was doing just that. But what did it really matter if he didn't know who founded the Merilith Art Academy? Montratchett the Fane said, the art is ours now. He felt his father was just making fun of him. I know it's us, but the phrase no. Lothian held a hand up to stop him. Not the fray ours. He pointed at himself, and then at Montaigne. Our family invented it. Your grandmother was the very first to use it when she taught others. Her lessons were always one-on-one or in small groups. The learning process was slow, random, inefficient. No one ever thought of formalizing the process until Puridian came up with the idea. He built the academy using the art the same way Fenelay created Avampartha. He taught a whole generation of Frey, trained them to teach, and appointed them as instructors in his school. Grindel and Orion were both his students. Wandala couldn't care less about the traitor, but he taught Grindel. Oh yes, I don't recall have I ever met Puridian. The Fane shook his head. He died before you were born. In fact, you could say your very existence is due to Puridian's death, which is why I find it so strange that you don't know about him. Montague glanced again at Sign, feeling certain his father was purposely humiliating him. The Fane noticed and shook his head. Trust me, this oversight is more embarrassing for me than for you. I should have mentioned him before. Why, who was he? Montaigne asked. Your brother. Chapter 6. Second best. That winter seeds were planted. The army learned to fight. Smiths learned to forge. People learned what it felt like to live in a house rather than a dirt-floored shack, and I learned to write. Human civilization was born under a blanket of snow, sheltered by walls of stone. The Book of Bryn. The little window in the door at the base of the pipe slid aside, exposing just a pair of eyes and part of a nose. As always, the sentinel said, state your business. This was repeated in Frey. Why, Wraith had no idea. Back again to see Persephone. State your name and your business with Madame Koenig. You know my name. Refusal to answer. Will, Wraith, and because I want to speak with her about what? None of your business. The little window snapped shut. But Wraith didn't leave. He waited. After living in Allenrest for 8 months, Wraith felt isolated, even though he resided in a city of more people than he ever thought existed lately. He'd been blaming it on the snow. Drifts blocked the narrow streets, sealing people inside, discouraging communal gatherings. By spring, he realized it wasn't the snow. To make matters worse, he was always cold for a man who grew up in a dirt house heated only by wafers of dung. The grand marbled holes of the wrist were surprisingly chilly. Dirt is wholesome, life-giving. Stone is just cold. It took only a single winter in the wrist for Wraith to develop a nostalgia for his youth and Dariah for the first time in recent memory. The weather had warmed and was downright hot. The snow was in full retreat, lingering only in deep shadows under bridges or tight alleyways. Birds were back, buds popped, flowers sprouted, and Wraith wasn't pleased with how things had been going, and the wrist wasn't his call. He was still just a chieftain of 1-2, if he included Malcolm, which he didn't. Now that Malcolm was back in the wrist, Wraith was less confident about the ex-slaves' loyalties. There wasn't anything Malcolm said or did, but Wraith felt things had changed between them, a feeling in his gut like a cold coming on. He started to lean against the bronze door that led to the inner sanctum of the fortress, but the sun had made it too hot to touch. He walked back across the bridge and peered over the edge. Long way down, he had no idea how far, but red roofs the size of cranberries spilled at his feet. Out to the east, he could see all the way to the rocky highlands beyond the High Spear Valley where his brothers had been slain. To the south, he could see the forks where his father's body lay, while his village was much closer. The great dome blocked the view, and he couldn't see where his mother and sister had died. His village was right underfoot, but hidden from him. He was surrounded by death in every direction, except one. Returning to the door, he beat on the bronze again. The window slid back once more. Yes, asked the eyes and nose. Still waiting. Did you have an appointment or what? Just tell Persephone I'm here, will you? And why does that matter? Because she's a friend of mine. And what? Wraith asked. That's what I'm asking. Madame Koenig is a very busy woman. If I can't inform her of what this meeting is pertaining to, I don't see how I can report it at all. It's not a meeting. I would just like to talk to her. That's what a meeting is, sir. Is the topic of your conversation a matter of wrist security? Is that why you are refusing to divulge its nature? If so, I can assure you that I am quite trusted by the administration of the Citadel, and you should have no concerns about revealing any information to me. Wraith didn't understand most of the words, even though he was certain they were in runic. Listen, I just want to say hello. If that's all, I can pass that information to her. You don't need to bother the Koenig. I also want to see how she's doing. Okay. So this is a cordial call, a purely social visit. Yeah, whatever, please wait. The little window slid shut again. Wraith backed away from the heat radiating door, wondering if the interior was roasting. That might account for the interaction. The guard's brains were baked once again. He went out on the bridge, but this time he looked up. The cape was a building of solid stone, as high as the Varinthian it had but one entrance, and its only windows were narrow slits near the top. This made the crypt and everything beyond it the most secured portion of the fortress. Anyone attacking would need to cross the Granford Bridge, break into the big gates, fight through the lower courtyard, climb the winding ramp, then battle through the narrow city streets, and that would just get them to the fortress proper, where another smaller wall and an additional set of bronze gates waited behind them. Was the upper courtyard, which housed the barracks, training fields, tannery, kitchens, smithies, and livestock pens. Above that, and up a steep, narrow staircase, was the domed Varinthian. An invading force would need to climb up that death trap of a staircase around the Varentian series of terraces and balconies, just to reach the long corbel bridge where Wraith now stood. Given that the famed spy rock, that sky-piercing watchtower of stone and glass, was on the far side of the cape and accessed by another bridge, it was the most isolated place in the Wrist complex so far. After more than 8 months of trying, Wraith had never made it farther than where he now stood. He hadn't been able to get inside the crypt, never made it past its bronze door. The little window opened once more. Madame Koenig is not available at this time. Before Wraith could say anything, the little window slammed shut, this time followed by a metal-on-metal snap in a field of grass scarred by patches of worn dirt. 4 men beat each other with sticks. A few others used metal swords, the more advanced ones the quick learners, but most swung hickory imitations at each other's heads. Wraith could tell the trainees were getting better, since wood-to-wood cracks outnumbered soft, fleshy slaps. In addition, the curses and genuine screams were rare. That morning, rapid staccato clacks carried across the training field, punctuated by the occasional hoot of success. See her? Malcolm asked, even before Wraith was completely down the stairs. I think she's taking a bath. Malcolm and Suri basked in the sun at the bottom of the stairs, reclining with their legs extended on the grass, to look like a pair of lizards basking in the heat. Malcolm craned his head back to squint at Wraith, turned away again. Did you tell them you're a chieftain? They know that. Wraith sat in the light alongside Suri. It felt good to soak up the sun, to feel it on his face. Never know how much you appreciate something until it's gone. Are you sure? Wraith nodded while watching the practice field, where the closest combatants were Farmer Whedon and one of the younger Gullah Pride, prevented the older northern men from training with the fray, but they sent their boys and young men who likely repeated everything they learned. When they returned home, everyone wore nothing but breech clouts, their skins slick and shiny with sweat. He could tell the better fighters by the number of grass blades stuck to the backs of their opponents. He's doing it on purpose, Wraith said. Nephrin, Suri offered. She had her eyes closed, hands folded on her chest, as if she were dead. Malcolm glanced at the girl, then back at Wraith. Nephrin, was there no? Well, I can't actually say. All I ever see are eyes and a nose, so maybe. But I'm sure it's by his orders, trying to keep me away from her. He doesn't like the competition. You think he's what you think Nephrin is? Romantically interested in Persephone, Wraith smirked. You are the one who once told me Frey and humans weren't so different. Remember, I'm not saying it's impossible, just wondering what makes you think he's interested. Suri answered for Wraith. It's because Nephrin raises his fur whenever Wraith gets too close. Raises his fur. Malcolm chuckled like a badger on a fresh kill. Gets all protective and tries to scare off anything that gets too close. When Malcolm chuckled again, she added, I wouldn't go laughing at a badger. No sense of humor, none at all. Trust me on that. Every time I see Persephone, he's there. I can't get the woman alone. They sit together at every public meal, at every council meeting. He finishes her sentences. Now have you noticed? Sari said, looking up at him while shielding her eyes from the sun. Wraith hadn't, but he'd seen little of Persephone of late. Most people weren't allowed inside the crypt. Persephone's personal attendants, such as Mora, Pedera, and Bryn, were among the few that had access. Suri could get in because she and Orion shared a room behind the bronze door. As for Wraith, he only saw Persephone during the large, noisy, obligatory, and increasingly infrequent council meetings held in the Verentian. He keeps her imprisoned in that tower like a dragon guarding its hoard. She's just busy. Malcolm said, you forget she's the Keening of the 10 clans. If you add the Estancia to that number, it means she's in control of the whole frontier. I've heard she has constant meetings all day and late into the night with all kinds of people, civic leaders from here who are still fearful of runes in their midst, messengers from all the rune villages, and Frey commanders keeping her posted on developments from as far away as Irvingen. What's Avalon? Another fortress like this, but north of here. All the Insteria outposts now fall under her control because they recognize Nephrin as head of the Insteria and rightful lord of the Wrist, and he acknowledges her rule as the Kinnig. He pointed at the Frey instructors moving through the combatants, holding their own little sticks and shouting instructions, encouragements, and insults. And then there are these fellows here. Persephone has them reporting on the training process. And there are the supply train organizers and the quartermasters giving reports on growth, field rotations, and forecasted yields, not to mention the Frey who keep the Wrist functioning. I've heard the wells are running low, and of course she has to listen to grievances in the High Court of the Carol. I have grievances, Rafe said. Malcolm plucked a long blade of grass from near the bottom step, but not pertaining to official business. The things I'm talking about are complaints about new regulations or unfair treatment. I'm being treated unfairly. She's my friend. I shouldn't need official business. I used to be able to just walk over and see her. Malcolm shrugged with an apologetic smile. Times change. Suri sat up and addressed Wraith. I've told you before I can get you in. Wraith looked at her and she smiled. Her grin was more than an offer to escort him through the door. She was hinting at greater consequences. Suri had spoken of her trip to the land of the dwarfs. Not all of it, he could tell. Some parts were too raw to get near. Her reluctance was similar to Wraith's silence about his family and life in Jiraiya. Certain moments were avoided, hinted at, but not trod upon, not from a lack of trust but a reluctance to walk over old graves. She told him enough to know that if so inclined, Suri could reduce the pipe to rubble or melt the bronze door to an insignificant puddle. This was what her grin meant, and that smile was accompanied by a mischievous twinkle in her eyes that said it would be as much fun for her as it would be advantageous for him. He smiled, but shook his head. If I really need to get in, I could. Frost or flood would pop the hinges off that door. Or I could just ask Bryn or Moyer to arrange an audience. My way would be more fun. Surly wiggled her eyebrows. Orion wouldn't like it. Wraith said, you know she wouldn't. I'd put it back. The mystic said. Wraith had no idea what it was she planned to put back the door. Maybe knowing her and judging from the size of that grin, it might be the entire front-facing wall of the Kype. So why don't you? Malcolm asked Wraith. Why not arrange for an audience? Because I don't want an audience with the king. I want to see Seth, and I don't want to see her if she doesn't want to see me. He pulled his legs up and sighed. I've been to that door a couple dozen times over the winter. Everyone knows. I'm sure she's heard by now, but even if she hasn't, why has she never come looking for me? And don't tell me she's busy. No one is that busy. The sound of cracking sticks diminished as most of the pairs stopped fighting. Everyone's attention was drawn to the center of the field where no grass grew, and to combatants faced off. What's going on? Wraith asked Tesh and Sabik. Malcolm replied again. The kids determined. Wraith backed up the steps to see over the heads of the sweaty men gathering in a ring around Sabek and Tesh. The two used actual swords, no shields, and were naked to the waist like everyone else. As always, Sabek held both his swords Nagin, and Tabor Tesh had his own pair of Roan made iron short swords. Over the course of 8 months, Tesh had excelled at combat, training the boy who had marked his 16th birthday just 2 months before had thrown himself into learning everything he could about fighting. He was out before dawn and came back to his bed late each night, falling asleep as soon as his head hit the mattress. At least twice, he never made it to the bed, and Wraith found him asleep on the floor or table with a half-eaten meal. Beside him, all the exercise and ample food had turned the one-time cadaverous whelp into a lean, muscular lad, still lanky, still not as tall as he would likely one day be. Tesh was already well on his way toward his goal of mastering the disciplines of the Galantians. Up for another beating, Sabek grinned, spinning to bore in his grip. Tesh didn't reply. He was crouched, blades up, concentrating, staring into Sabek's eyes. No one fought Sabek except Tesh. The fray didn't teach, he humiliated. He also injured. Everyone knew Sabek was talented enough to avoid injuring his opponents, but he was easily irritated by weak competition and showed his disappointment by drawing blood. During one match, a terrified farmer from Menahan started crying, and Sabek responded by cutting off the man's little finger. No one fought Sabek after that, no one except Tesh. The lad desperately wanted to beat the master. The desire had turned into an obsession. The kid invited Sabek to come at him, and Sabek obliged. His two blades looked more like 10 as they whirled in circles, crisscrossing their course in a weaving pattern that left only streaks. The blades themselves moved too fast to be seen. When Tesh's swords collided with Sabek's, the sound was the crash of metal waves upon a metal shore. There were sparks. Wraith never saw any other colliding blades spark. He had witnessed the Galantians sparring with each other. Warith and Tekchin frequently held grudge matches, but their clashes didn't kick sparks. When Tesh fought Sabek, it always produced a light show. The boy fell back. He always did. An onslaught from Sabek was a force of nature that couldn't be resisted or contained. Wraith remembered the one time he'd battled Sabek, and it had been nothing like this. The fray had calculatingly probed and then disarmed Wraith with his bare hand. Tesh was genuinely trying to win. He managed to catch strokes he couldn't see, deflecting blind thrusts and ducking swipes even before they were made. Tesh looked like he was reading the fray's mind, and still Sabek was way out ahead, planning 3 strokes in advance, knowing not only that Tesh would manage to block, but how he would block. Sabek formulated attacks to counter Tesh's moves. Before the lad even thought of them, all 48 men stood in the field, intently watching what was sure to be the most amazing display of combat any of them had ever seen. The spectators winced, gasped, and cringed. Always after the fact, after disaster almost happened, reactions were too slow to keep pace. By Marah's name, the kid is really good. Wraith wondered how such a thing was possible. After only a year, no, not just a year, he's Dryan. That kid's been fighting his whole life. He remembered how Tesh had brandished a dagger the day they first met, and how the boy had tripped him numerous times when the two sparred on the beaches of Daltair. Wraith had thought Tesh was entertaining. He'd no idea what the kid was capable of. He might have been able to kill me. Even back then, it was like I was playing with a lion cub, and now it outweighs me. Wraith never saw it happen. Everything was too quick. He heard it, though. An off note, a clang instead of a ping, and one of Tesh's swords flew from his hands. Sabek didn't let up. He attacked with unrelenting aggression. Tesh couldn't block both of Sabek's swords. With just his one, the boy caught the first, but the second came across his open side. Sabek was going to exact payment for the fight. He was going to cut Tesh across the chest, leave a mark his opponent wouldn't forget. But that didn't happen. Tesh slapped the blade away with his bare hand. He did it 3 times before Sabek stopped the fight and lowered his blades. He nodded better. The crowd of sweat-slick men erupted into cheers and shouts of jubilation. Sabek hadn't been beaten. The match wasn't even close to a draw. Disarming Tesh counted as a victory, and the kid hadn't mounted even a single offense in the whole match, but he had held his own, and for the men on that field it was a victory beyond any of their dreams. Sabek flipped Tesh's lost sword into the air with his foot and struck it With a sharp swing from his own blade, sending the weapon spinning at the kid, Tesh caught it by its handle and slammed both blades into their scabbards. "Well done," Tekler Sabek said, as if the contest had been the finale. Training for that day ended. When everyone rushed to clap Tesh on the back, Wraith turned to Malcolm. "What's it mean?" What Sabek called Tesh Turklaw. Malcolm said, "It means swift of hand, or just swift hand, I suppose." "Great, the kid's going to be impossible to live with now." Wraith grumbled. Malcolm nodded. "Probably, but you ought to consider yourself fortunate. Next to Nephrin, you've got the best shield." And Alan wrist. Wraith frowned. "Apparently, I'm second best to Nephrin in a number of things." Chapter 7 Dreams and Nightmares. "I started writing to chase away demons and to preserve the loved ones I had lost. After all these years, none of that has changed." The Book of Bryn. The moist hand clamped over Bryn's mouth, the other one wrapped around her waist, trapping her arms. She was hauled away, her heels dragging across stone as the row rasped in her ear. "Relax, don't struggle, I have you now. Just need to get you back to the pile." Back to the pile. Bryn couldn't scream, couldn't move. She could barely breathe. She tried to kick her feet, but that did nothing to save her. As disgusting as it might be, she tried to bite the hand, but her mouth couldn't open. The thing continued to whisper in a frighteningly reassuring tone, as if it were trying to save her, but it wasn't speaking to her. "Not really. Yes, everything will be okay. We have you now. Just need to get back to the pile. Need to get back so I can eat and finally sleep." She felt it lick her cheek. Such a sweet face. She woke up, her heart racing. Something covered her face, making it hard to breathe. Bryn reached up and found the pillow, ripping it away. She threw it on the floor. "Stupid thing," she whispered in the dark, shaking. She propped herself on her elbows and took a few more breaths, calming down. The Roe was long dead, and Bryn was in a pretty little home on Lionette Street in Little Wren. Moonlight entered the window, casting a skewed square across the floor, the wall, and over the feet of the two beds. Roan's was empty again. Downstairs, Padera was snoring. Bryn's nightshirt stuck to the sweat on her skin. She shivered, drawing the blanket around her. Just a dream, she imagined her mother saying, "Go back to sleep." But Bryn knew that if she tried, the Rao would come again. It always did. Once the Rao invaded her sleep, only daylight chased it off. She'd managed to go a whole week this time, without a visit. But tonight she leaned over the edge of the bed and pointed a finger at the fallen pillow. "I blame you." Bryn wasn't used to pillows, never had one before. The bag full of feathers collapsed under the weight of her head, folding in and doing its best to smother her. She sighed, frowned, and folded her arms. She wasn't going back to sleep anytime soon. She'd be exhausted in the morning, but there was no getting around it. She was up. She started to swing her feet off the side of the bed, but pulled them back at the last second. She spun around on her stomach and carefully lowered her head to peer under the bed. Then she looked under. Roan's. Nothing. Relief and embarrassment washed over her in equal part. "How old am I?" She got up and fumbled in the dark, her hands searching for the leather satchel. She had made the carrying case herself. A single piece of goat hide was folded around her stack of parchments and bound up with straps from the small night table. She grabbed up a handful of quills. Bryn had been using reeds dipped in ink to mark on the pages, but found the quills better after employing hundreds of people to strip birds of their feathers for making arrows. Alan Risted had piles of naked quills lying around. They too were hollow and much more durable than reeds. Thanks to Moya, Bryn had hundreds. Ben carried the parchments, ink, and quills to the desk by the window and set them down. After a long winter, she had an impressive pile of vellum parchment. Part of the stack was a translation, as best she could manage, of the tablet rubbings they had saved from the old one's chamber in Neath. She was still working on those, but after translating the metallurgy portion for Rowan, she had jumped ahead in order to record more recent events while things were still fresh in her mind. She did that a lot. Bryn first started writing about growing up in Dowran, focusing on her parents. Then she jumped forward to the trip Persephone led to Neath. She went to great literary effort to eviscerate Gronbach the dwarf, recording his treachery as a legendary, the very definition of evil. Then Bryn jumped even further ahead and wrote about life in Alanras Frey, and runes mingled about, as well as fire and ice, Orgullah and Ruolin, who also had problems coexisting. A number of outbursts had resulted in some deaths. Persephone decided to segregate the tribes. Before riots broke out, the cold weather helped to cool tempers. But both were warming up again. Since sleep wasn't an option, she thought she'd do some writing. But before starting, she decided to reread the section where the Gilibernate the Rao, her favorite part. The night was cold, and she grabbed a blanket from her bed and was searching for a lamp when she heard voices coming from the street below who was out chatting in the middle of a chilly night. She returned to the window and leaned closer. Whoever it was spoke softly, and in runic, "No, I forbid it, and you know better than to be out here. I am hungry," the voice said in a hoarse whisper, just like in her dream. Bryn shivered. "I'll arrange it like I did with Jara. You have to trust me. Haven't I taken care of you in the past? You need to be patient. It's been a long time. I'm tired and need to sleep. We have an agreement. Spring is here, and the time is approaching. Until then, you need to stay hidden. I can smell them, all of them, so many. The wind blows south. It's maddening. It won't be long now, I promise. Then you can kill for me. Now let's go back, and don't slip out again, or we'll both be killed." With every ounce of courage she could muster, Bryn pushed the window open wider and stuck her head out far enough to look down. All she saw were a pair of shadows disappearing around the corner of her building in the dark of her room, barely illuminated by the pale moonlight. She drew the blanket tighter and shivered early. The next morning, Bryn stood in front of her adopted home, looking up at the bedroom window. The house was one of the many two-story whitewash and timber buildings. This was no warrior's home. Its carved door tile and stencil work, branching stair banister, and flower beds filled with perennials already beginning to bloom spoke of a place once cherished. Bryn felt guilty being there, and in 8 months she hadn't so much as moved the furniture. Persephone had insisted they weren't conquerors of Alan Rist, but all eyes, what Nephron referred to as liberators. A fair number of Frey had packed up and walked out. Theophany let them go. Wuhana Hill, one of the nicer parts of the city, became the first to empty that previous autumn when the Frey fled. Alan Rist Wuhana Hill became a neighborhood of empty houses, and Persephone filled the vacant buildings with surviving inhabitants of Dowrin, creating the Run district. Given that most of the other clans had homes to return to, Wuhana Hill became known as Little Wren. The house that Pedera, Roan, and Bryn shared was one of the finest. There were bigger, more elaborate ones, but inch for inch this one was the most pleasant. Bryn was certain that wasn't an accident. Persephone would have invited them to stay with her in the crypt if such a thing had been practical or desired. No one, not even Persephone, liked the stark, cold fortress filled with intimidating male Astoria. Many of the Frey in the city were female, and while they didn't exactly welcome the runes, they didn't protest either, at least not publicly. Over the winter, Little Wren had begun to resemble Dowrin if it had died and gone to Allison. The well in the center of the tree-lined square was frequented by the likes of Arlen, Aviv, Baker, and Autumn, whose husbands, like most of the able men, were in training and bunked at the fortress. Gifford lived in Little Wren too, as did Tressa Habert and Matthias Hager, who was too old to walk up the hill steps alone. Pedera was the first to call it Little Wren, and that's how everyone living there had come to see it. But on that morning, looking up at her pretty new home, Bryn saw that part of town as sinister. They had stood right here. She looked around, trying to gauge the exact spot where the two speakers had held their conversation. They didn't sound human. Ben imagined them as a pair of Rao, but that was most certainly the result of her nightmare. And they had spoken runic, not Frey. Near the corner of the block, just below her window, was a flower bed. The for delicate sprouts that had emerged with the warming weather had been crushed, pressed down in the soft dirt. She bent over to look at the depression in the soil. Blew something. The voice came from directly behind her, heart pounding. Bryn shot up and spun so fast she nearly fell. A hand grabbed her forearm, catching her. Terrified, she pulled back and nearly screamed. But it wasn't a row that had hold of her. "Oh, sorry, didn't mean to scare you," the young man said, letting her go the moment she was steady again. "Shouldn't sneak up on people." Then Bryn snapped. The moment she spoke, she wished she could take the words back. This wasn't the first time Bryn had seen this particular young man. She had first noticed him in the training yard, a place she'd passed each day when delivering Roan's midday meal. If left to herself, Roan would forget to eat, so Pedera cooked and Bryn delivered. Would-be warriors were always practicing in the upper courtyard in front of the smithy. And this young man was always there, even in the snow and rain. On warm days he'd take his shirt off, and Bryn was thankful. He was so intent on his lessons that he didn't see her sneaking a peek his way. His body was pure lean muscle, but it was his smile that attracted her most. As he sparred, a huge grin dominated his face, like he was taking down a giant or slaying a dragon. Something wonderfully wild lay behind such a grand grin. She'd felt the same way about Wraith when he first came to Dowran. Neither of these men were farmers, shepherds, or woodcutters. When she first noticed the young man, she thought he looked familiar back in Tyre. There had been a boy, a scrawny kid, who lived with Wraith, and Malcolm. Bryn only noticed him because he was one of the few beneath the wall who was her age, and he came to the few chieftain meetings that Wraith had attended. But the young man she watched practicing in the upper yard, the same one who'd just grabbed her arm, was bigger, fuller, and taller. He sported disheveled locks, dark, beautiful eyes, and patches of hair on his cheeks and chin. The boy she knew from Tyre had been covered in a torn, stained rag. This man wore a long shirt cinched tight at his waist by a sword belt holding to blades. What had started as a chore became the most anticipated part of her day. After dropping off the food for Rowan, Bryn would linger in the yard outside the smithy, watching. Each day she hoped he would notice her, but he never looked her way. During the long walk back home, she daydreamed about the day they would eventually meet. Most scenarios involved him making some blunder, falling. Perhaps he'd feel foolish, look awkward, but she would smile and make light of the misstep, assuring him it happened to everyone. Then he would invite her to take a walk as they strolled through some lovely forest. Not that there were any within today's travel. She would tell him about her book. She'd talk about language, writing, and the story she had found on the tablets. From Neath, the young hero would be so impressed that he would fall in love with her. They would marry, have children, then grandchildren, and finally die in each other's arms. Wrinkled and gray. Reality was quite different. I wasn't sneaking, you certainly weren't announcing yourself from afar. Bryn didn't know why she said it. She was nervous, off balance, and the words just came out, and they came out angry. Well, he looked awkward, then glanced at the house. I was looking for Roan the metalsmith. I heard she lived around here. She does. Bryn then eyed him suspiciously. What do you want with her? I want to be fitted for armor. Oh, Bryn said stupidly. Having saved her from falling, he remained close. She could have leaned out and kissed him. The thought hovered in her mind, forming a terrible distraction, catching herself wondering how moronic she must look. Staring his way, she blinked. Rowan works up at the fortress in the upper courtyard. She lives here, is supposed to, at least, but she spends all her time over there. Yeah, I know. The pair of lips, dark eyes, and open shirt said, but I was just up there. And what he shrugged. I didn't see her anywhere around, so I thought maybe she came here, and then I found you on all fours groping around the ground. So I wasn't on all fours, and I most certainly wasn't groping. He held up his hands honestly. I don't know what you were doing. If you must know, I was looking for footprints. Another sentence she wished she could take back. This conversation is not at all like I imagined. His eyes narrowed. You are what? Never mind, Roan's not here. The young man hesitated, then finally nodded, turned, and walked away. You're such an idiot, Bryn screamed in her head. Great impression. Maybe if I'd actually been eating the dirt, if I'd had a mouthful of soil that was spilling in clumps over my lips. And it was, why were you looking for footprints? The young man had stopped. He was staring back at her. I heard people talking below my window last night. I was wondering who they were, and you thought you could tell that by their footprints. He lifted his own foot and looked at the bottom. You can do that. She scowled. He was making fun of her. Now he thinks I'm an idiot. Great. No, she felt her heart sink. Please just leave. She felt so awful she might cry, and absolutely didn't want him to see that. He turned to walk away again, but once more stopped. Okay, so you have to tell me or it'll bother me all day. Why were you looking for footprints? How would that help you identify who these people were? I hate my life. Bryn didn't say anything. She didn't trust herself to talk anymore, and thought he might just leave if she remained silent. He didn't. Feeling stupid. No, she was well beyond that. She sighed. I never had a chance with him anyway. What was I thinking? I was dreaming. Look at him, gorgeous, strong, dashing, and those eyes, and then there's me, a pale twig with no shape, an orphan who spends her days scribbling nonsense. with discarded quills. He never was going to be interested in me. I might as well light the pyre under that dream and just let the whole thing burn. I was looking for footprints that weren't human. Are Frey feet that different? Not Frey. He looked at her puzzled. You mean, wait, what do you mean, a dog or something? She shook her head. Dogs don't talk. He stared at her, eyes narrowed, his head tilted slightly to one side. Then what do you think was below your window last night? Don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. He walked back to her. His expression was exactly how she pictured he would look as she captivated him with tales of her literary prowess just before he fell in love with her. But that wasn't going to happen now. She sighed and gave up. A row, you moron. Bryn, I told you not to say it. Idiot, idiot. He'd laugh now. No, most likely he'd ask what a row was and then not believe her when she explained. She'd face the humiliating experience of telling the tale of how she'd once nearly had her face eaten by one. Any thoughts about her being the sort of person he should stay clear of would be confirmed. He'd see her for what she really was, the real her, what she never was in her fantasies. Really, he said. Bryn didn't know how to respond. She searched his eyes for evidence of sarcasm, his lips for hints of mockery. Nothing obvious. At least you believe me? He nodded easily, shifting his weight and resting a hand on the butt of one sword. The confident, casual act was so insanely attractive that Bryn sucked in a breath. My mother told me about the Rao come from bodies left unburied, people who were wronged in life, betrayed. Usually, wait, you're Bryn, aren't you? Her throat closed on her. She swallowed hard to clear it. You know me well. He chuckled. What? Her heart hesitated mid-beat. He pointed to the house. I was told Roan Padera and Bryn lived here. I've met Roan. Then he chuckled again. I'm guessing you aren't Padera. Oh, Bryn laughed. Then to no, I'm not her. Yeah, I heard she's like a couple 100 years old and doesn't have any teeth. She nodded. Anteshi extended a hand. Bryn hadn't shaken many hands. Her mother and friends were huggers. Unsure and tentative, she reached out. He did the rest. He had rough skin that in places was polished to smooth calluses and a firm grip that tightened in stages. But he didn't squeeze. He pulled her hand toward him, giving it 3 solid pumps before letting go. Nice to meet you, she replied, then immediately wondered if that was the right thing to say. She'd thought it was appropriate, but coming out of her mouth it sounded too formal. And why do you think a row was here? He asked, looking down at the flower bed. She shrugged. Her hand was still up from the shake. Then she had to will it down to her side. She could still feel the warmth of his palm. It's hard to explain, but what they were saying was round talk, yes, but maybe it wasn't a row. Maybe it was one row and one. I'm not sure. I only know for certain that one was a row. How do you know? The voice, it sounded. Tesh's eyes grew big, realization dawning. Your Bryn, we've already established that. I mean the Bryn Roan mentioned. You told us about how you were grabbed by a Rao under a Durg mountain. She said you almost had your face eaten off. Thanks a lot, Roan. I should just die now. Is it the same one? Did it follow you? Tesh looked around as if the monster might jump out at them from a nearby hedge. No, Bryn said. The one in Neath was killed. So why is this one after you? Do you think it knew the other round after me? The thought rocked her. Is it? It was outside my window, wasn't it? I didn't until just now. Thanks. I'll never sleep again. Sorry. He looked guilty, which only made him more handsome. What did it say? What did you hear? The Rao said it was hungry, and the other one insisted it was too dangerous, and it had to wait. Said he would bring the Rao something to eat, that he would arrange it like he did with Jarda. What's Jarda? No idea. And they weren't both Rao. I don't know. Only one of them had a voice like the one I heard in Neath, but maybe not all Raos sound alike. What did it sound like? A raspy, dry whisper. Tash looked less convinced. Maybe it was just an old man with a cold. She shook her head. I'm just saying. I mean, he looked around again. What would a Rao be doing here? Brow live in remote places where they can keep their piles of bones. They need them to sleep on. At least that's what my mother told me. Rao roam the countryside looking for victims, because once they wake they can't sleep again until they feed, until they add bones to their pile. So how could such a thing live here? Where would it keep its pile? People would notice. Well, she said, figuring it out as she spoke. Maybe someone is hiding it. Tash looked skeptical. Someone is hiding a row. It sounded that way. That's like saying a lamb is hiding a lion, Why wouldn't the roe just eat the person keeping it? I don't know. Tesh scratched his head and narrowed his eyes. Unless that person was free, maybe raw. Don't eat fry. Bryn shook her head. They were speaking runic. Tesh looked skeptical. Bryn shrugged. Maybe it was just an old man with a cold. Tesh looked up at the house again. Maybe you should keep your window closed and bolted just the same. Huh? Yeah, she said. An awkward silence followed. Finally she said, well, when I see Roan, I'll mention you were looking for her, right? And I guess I'll check back at the smithy. Sounds like a plan. Bryn said she was torn. On the one hand, she didn't want him to go, but on the other, she didn't think she could endure more self-inflicted humiliation. Bryn watched him walk down the road around a corner. Tesh, she thought, not a bad name. She had expected something more like Spencer or Stanton. He looked like a Stanton, or maybe a Bryn. She turned to see him coming back into sight, waving for her to join him. She trotted down and followed him around the corner. There, in another bed of would-be flowers, Tesh pointed to two sets of footprints. One was clearly made by a pair of common sandals. The other was barefoot and had just 3 toes and long sharp claws. Chapter 8, the Tutelman, which I think we accept all too readily. What we're told by those we love, it isn't that our friends and family lie, but that they don't know the truth. The book of Bryn Gefford sat in the corner on a small stool, his usual place. When visiting Roan, she had a staff of more than 20, and a cripple. Anywhere else in the workshop was a roadblock to progress. He watched her work and hoped to be on hand if she paused to eat the meals that Padera made, and Bryn carried up. The weather being so nice, he even dreamed of persuading her to go out to the courtyard for a picnic. He figured his chances were about the same as beating Bryn in a foot race. But if there was one thing Gifford had in abundance, it was dreams. Leaning back against the wall of the smithy, he watched Roan beat sparks out of a brilliantly glowing glob. She didn't hit very hard and had to take frequent rests, but there was a single-minded clarity of purpose behind each stroke. When beating metal, Ron was more authoritative, decisive, and sure of herself than Nephron. When he gave a speech at the General Assembly, even the 3 dwarves took direction from her. Creating iron swords turned out to be harder than anyone had thought. That included Ronan. Her first attempt ended in failure. Observing the process was distinctly different from replicating it. Brown had lamented her misery, explaining the hundreds of little specifics. She hadn't noticed things. She didn't even know to look for the amount of air, when to pump the bellows, the exact time and temperature to leave a blade in the furnace, the ratio of carbon to iron, and how often to temper. They saw their first snowfall before Ronan produced her first sword, and it was an awful-looking thing, heavy and dull. Gifford expected the dwarfs to be of more help, but as it turned out, none of them had a clue about metallurgy. Still, Frost and Flood were able to build first-rate forges and workstations throughout the fortress and the city by studying the ones the Fray had made. This tripled the smithing capacity of Alan Rist. They also trained members of each clan who were charged with going back to their dolls and building their own equipment. While Frost and Flood were busy building the infrastructure of smithing, Rain spent the winter days leading teams of miners who dug for raw materials. It wasn't long before carts of iron and coal flooded into Alan Rist. All this help was well appreciated, but it was up to Ron to figure out the magical secrets of metallurgy and the keys to sword-making. A major breakthrough occurred when Bryn finished translating the entire text from their trip to Neath. Gifford had been there when she read the passages. Roan had sat in open-mouthed wonder, listening to what Bryn said, calling the girl a genius. Bryn laughed, saying she had no idea what she just said, but Rain understood at least some of it. Despite Bryn's genius, Roan continued to struggle, and the number of failures grew into a mountain that the dwarfs routinely melted down for new attempts. But it wasn't just the method that vexed Roan. Part of the problem was her inability to physically wield a heavy hammer. That issue was largely resolved when she created a smaller, more Roan-sized tool. The last part of the equation was Roan's belief that the formulas of the old one weren't right. Maybe Bryn translated incorrectly, or perhaps the prisoner in the Agave had held back some of his secrets, but she kept insisting that she could do better. Even after her first success, Roan wasn't satisfied. She was looking for something more. Under pressure from Persephone, Roan was forced to establish a method others could duplicate, even though it wasn't as good as Roan thought it could be. By midwinter, human-made iron weapons were being produced at varying degrees of quality all over Ruang. But Ron continued her struggle to find a secret only she seemed to know existed. Gifford could see it in her face, in the way her eyes searched in a void for answers to questions no one even knew to ask. She saw something no one else could, heard music others were deaf to, and for Roan iron wasn't good enough on that spring day. Gifford sat in the corner, watching Roan use her whole body when swinging her specially made hammer. Her hair, chopped to a short practical length, still hung in front of her eyes. A drop of sweat always dangled from the tip of her nose, and in her eyes was a fire hotter than the furnace. The woman was possessed. She is fighting her own war. Watching Gifford had to wonder if Roan was happy. He imagined she liked feeling useful, and he knew she loved working, but Persephone had asked for 10,000 swords, helms, and shields of the finest metal. It didn't matter that by spring hundreds of smiths all over Rulon were working night and day to meet the quota. Persephone's decree was for Roan her own personal task. Her fight to win or lose Ronan was the faithful hound who had run to death for her master. Was it a tragedy when such a dog died, or was that the life and death the animal would have chosen? Ron put down the hammer and set the glowing glob back into the fire. She wiped her forehead with the rag that was never far from her left hand. Yuhungi woman, hearing her name, she looked up, her face red from the exertion and heat. She raised her brows in surprise. When did you get here this morning? Gifford replied. Oh, she said, considering his answer. Didn't see you come in. He held up the cloth sack and shook it side to side. When went to all the trouble of bringing it to you. Seems a waste not to eat. Ronan hated waste. Maybe later. Ronan said, I want to get some more done before noon. Gifford held back a laugh. No, will be night soon. Night. Gifford nodded. She looked out the window. I guess so. Ronan looked back at him apologetically. And you've been here since this morning? I'm so sorry I was so. He threw up a hand. No need to explain. You be busy. I know it's fine. All of humanity depends on the swing of that mallet. But you need to eat. Yes, I suppose. She looked back at the crates of iron ore that would have to be smelted, then at the dwindling pile of charcoal. Wagon pulled into the yard. Another delivery. Roan rushed out. He could hear her voice outside shouting, "Where's it?" From the reply was a list of village names that Gifford had never heard of. Rowan probably knew every one of them. In her head she likely had a list and mentally checked off the locations. Plenty of shields. Why so few swords? Gifford didn't hear the reply. The man's voice was low and didn't carry the way Roan's did. She stayed out there until the weapons were unloaded and the wagon rolled out. Then she returned, wiping her hands on her apron. Immediately she picked up her hammer and headed for the forge. Whale, you need to eat. Gifford said, you still here? Yes, well, still am, and you still need to eat. You know, food, it's like the fuel you put in the furnace. If you don't keep putting some in, the furnace goes out and all things shut down. Don't want that, do you? She smirked at him. He shook the bag once more. Smells good. I think it's chicken. She mopped her brow again and, wiping her hands on the leather apron, walked over. Let's eat outside, he said. Why? She pierced him with an intense stare. Anyone unfamiliar with her would have seen it as suspicious or accusing. Gifford saw it as the bright light of a focused mind, capable of seeing beyond the shadows that confused everyone else. Ronan always wanted to know the why of everything. I have this old friend I want you to meet. Gifford replied, you like him? He's quiet but pleasant, handsome, and especially bright. Another smirked. The sun, he grinned. It's nice out. Pretty, even with the desperate concern of a young mother asked to leave her child with an irresponsible guardian. She looked back at the ore glowing in the fire. Gifford pressed his lips together as he imagined how Roan would one day have her own children and look exactly that way. Gifford wouldn't be the father. He couldn't even be a guardian. She couldn't trust the wretched cripple to protect her baby. The thought hit him hard. He felt it in his stomach like a punch, and in his throat like a hand squeezing so hard he couldn't breathe. What's wrong? Ron asked, the bright light of her stare upon him again, eyes that saw far too much. Nothing, he managed to say. You look in pain. Are you feeling okay? He put a hand to his chest. Nothing a little sun wouldn't fix. As they walked out of the smithy into the sun-bathed courtyard filled with the grunts, shouts, and clangs of men training to fight, Gifford mentally chided himself. Greedy is what I I should appreciate that she talks to me at all. If I hadn't messed her up so badly, she wouldn't dream of eating a meal with me. She'd have already married one of Tope's boys and wouldn't be allowed to speak to the twisted pottery goblin. The thought was well-intentioned, But the pain devouring his insides wasn't listening. He was going to lose her when the better man came along, which could be virtually anyone. No, not anyone, not me. I'm not the one man whose touch she can accept. The man who could take her in his arms, who could kiss her without her screaming. That day would come. He knew it would. He prayed each day for Mara to heal Roan, to let her live the normal life she deserved. He had faith it would happen, and when that day finally came, he would cheer for her, even if that same day his heart would shatter in happiness as he knew it would fly out of his world. How about this, he said, finding a sunny patch of thick grass far enough outside that the sounds of crashing hammers wouldn't interfere with conversation, which she told him, and took off her apron. Ground will be wet this time of year. She laid the thick leather out for them to sit on. He smiled. What? He shook his head. Nothing, just you, just me. What? I just love you. That's all. I love you with every breath, every thought, every beat of my heart. Because you're more than a person. You're a world unto yourself, a rich, vibrant, exciting, fascinating universe, and I want to spend my life exploring every forest, field and stream. Always thinking, he said. Wrong. Looked down at the leather beneath her knees and shrugged. Just didn't want us to get muddy. He dumped at the bag's contents. Chicken legs. Roan burst out with a huge smile. I love chicken legs. I'll have when you have the other. They both for you. No, no. She was shaking her head even as she bit into the first leg. This isn't my meal. I'm just going to watch you eat. You have some too. It's good. She wiped grease from her chin, then grabbed up the other leg and held it out. I'll have a bite. Oh, and yellow cheese, she said, unwrapping the cloth-covered hunk. He watched her devour the food in precise bites, while in front of them a class of soldiers practiced moves under the barking tutelage of a frayed instructor. Behind them, the smithy's little chimney belted black smoke that blew east with the spring breeze. Ronan forced him to eat some of the chicken before she finished it. Nice out, isn't it? He lay back on his elbows. They were off the apron, and he felt the wet soak into his sleeves. What do you say we do this every day? Chewing. Rome looked around and nodded, but he wasn't certain which question she was answering. If you like, we could go for a walk, he ventured. Can't? She pointed at the smithy and swallowed. Have too much work, I thought. Persephone said. She was astounded by how much he'd accomplished. Still behind, says who, me? But I'm only asking. I can't, she told him. Gifford was disappointed, even a little upset. He saw so little of her that he was slipping into his own depression. That was how he tried to rationalize everything afterward, but in truth he didn't know why he said it. It just came out. It's like old Ivy is alive again. Ron looked as if he'd hit her with a smithing hammer. She stared down at the food, at the sack it came in, and at the grease on her hands. You talked to Pedero, didn't you? Gifford had no idea what she meant. I have talked to that old woman on many occasions. Ronan began to shake. Gifford felt his heart sink. He'd done something terrible. He'd hurt her somehow. What's wrong? Won't, don't blame her. It wasn't. Ronan began to cry. Gifford hated himself. He had no idea what he'd done, but nothing in the world was worse than hurting Roan. He wanted to make it better, but didn't know how because he didn't know what he'd done. Roan, what's going on? She got up then and ran back to the smithy, abandoning her apron. Gifford and the warmth of the sun. The old woman was in the kitchen cutting mushrooms into a series of neat slices while kettle boiled over the cook fire. What do you want? She asked as Gifford let himself in. I just had a meal with home, he said, with an ominous tone in his voice. Doubt that you just had a meal with home. Pedera scraped her choppings into her palm and tossed them into the pot. If you ate with her, it would have been in the smithy, which had to have been hours ago. Giving your lightning fast travel speed, or has love given you invisible wings? Gifford was going to be polite. She was an old woman after all. He planned on being compassionate, easing his way to the point. But Pedero was being her normal witch self, and Gifford cut right to the dark meat. Did you kill Ivy? The thought had come to him on the walk from the fortress, which was just as long as Pedera described. It had also given him ample time to ponder why Roan was so upset. Guilt. She blamed herself for Ivor's death because Pedera had killed him on her behalf. The old woman had her back to him as she faced the fire. Pedera was just as hunched over as ever, her true form hidden beneath layers of old wool. By Ivy, do you mean Ivor the carver? Gifford scowled. She knew who he meant. Yes. Why do you say that? Her tone was controlled, even relaxed. Why not surprised? Why not outraged? Why not laughter? Why hadn't she asked if he was making a joke or yell at the false accusation? I told you I just had a meal with Rowan, a meal that ended with Rowan weeping. I would imagine any meal with you would end that way. You did it, didn't you? He hobbled to the table and looked at the pile of uncut mushrooms with such a shock. When he just died, when he went to sleep and failed to wake up, did you poison him? Padera silently prodded the fire. How you find these mushrooms? He asked. We all new to this place, but you can locate mushrooms, and some mushrooms be poisonous. Padre turned and peered with her one eye. What are you saying? How old is you? How old are you? She corrected him. You know, I can't say that. If you can't talk, you should keep your mouth shut. How old? He persisted. Don't know. Lost count. Aha, you always say that when anyone asks, don't you? What does my age have to do with this? You owe this in Dalwyn. What if it crippled? Boy, her voice took on an edge. So maybe you not even from when? Maybe you've just showed up one day and have outlived all who knew that. Padera shambled back to the table and sat down in front of her mushrooms. And I suppose my husband Melvin and our sons were imaginary. Maybe I not met Melvin, not met sons. Because you're a child, most children outlive parents. No, they don't. She looked almost sad, but it was hard to tell with that leathery melon face of hers. Most people don't live as long as I have. I'm thinking maybe no one lives as long as you. Again, she gave him the squint. What are you saying, Gimp? I'm saying that maybe you don't just look and act like a witch. He saw the change in her face, a twitch, a grimace, brief, but it was there. He touched a nerve. All people say the name, use it when cussing, just the name, not a god, so it's safe. But what if it isn't just a name? What if the witch is real? Padera's malleable lips folded up into a smile. So you aren't just accusing me of being a witch. You're saying I'm the witch. All those tales have to begin someplace. What stories are those? That's just it. All the land knows the name, but no one knows what it means. I think you do. She nodded yes. I to this admission surprised him for all his bluster and uncertainty. He had still been guessing. He'd even been glad Bryn was gone. He had wanted to speak to Padera alone. If he'd really believed his own suspicions, he wouldn't have walked into that witch's den alone. In retrospect, that might not have been the best idea. No one knew he was there. So was Ivy poisoned? He asked. Yes. Padera picked up her knife. Ivy was a bad man. No one knew that. No one except me. Well, and Ronan, of course he hurt her. But you already know that all of Dalwyn knows that. No, people suspect, but no one knows. Even I don't know all of it. She leaned back and fixed him with a one-eyed glare. Did you know he killed Rain's mother? Won told me she died like mine in childbirth. Assuming you mean childbirth. She tells everyone that. I think she's getting to the point where she can almost believe it. In the past, the look Padera fixed on him had been an eccentricity, but standing before that mushroom-strewn table, Jefford now found it frightening. She cast a hex with a look like that he had both of them to himself. The old woman went on. Roan and her mother Rihanna, both slaves with no recourse. Everyone saw Ivor as a great man, a pillar of the community, because he was also careful and kept his depravity confined to the inside of his home. I lived the closest. I heard the screams, and I didn't buy his explanations. I knew better. I'd seen his like before Rihanna tried to run. Rain was about 9, and Rihanna was pregnant again. I think maybe she refused to give him another child, or perhaps Rain was starting to grow up, starting to look more like a woman, and Rihanna knew what that meant. She wrapped Roan up and plotted to leave. Ren had no idea where to go or how she'd live. Rihanna was a slave, the only one in Ren. At the time, Ivor had bought her while at an auction in Doria. Once she had been a gullah, a war trophy.